Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Before the city sleeps, let me ask you a quiet question meant to linger rather than alarm. How could a single ordinary spark, born in a darkened kitchen, undo the greatest city in England in just a few days? Tonight's story begins not with panic or shouting, but with stillness, with streets settling into night, with a city confident in its own endurance and unaware of how fragile it truly is. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. London, in the year 1666, was a city that believed it had already endured its worst. Only a year earlier, plague had hollowed out whole neighbourhoods. Church bells had tolled so often that silence itself had begun to feel suspicious. Yet by the late summer of 1666, the city was breathing again. Shops reopened, markets filled. Children returned to alleyways and wharves. Life, for all its rough edges, had resumed its steady pace. Londoners were used to hardship. Fire was a familiar danger, but also a familiar companion. Hearths burned day and night. Bakeries worked through the dark hours. Candles lit nearly every room. Fire was part of daily survival, not an omen. The city itself was old, dense, and layered with centuries of habit. Medieval street plans still shaped movement. Buildings leaned inward over narrow lanes, upper floors jutting out as if trying to touch across the road. Timber frames, pitch, tar and thatch were everywhere, cheaper and faster to build with than stone. These materials creaked and warmed in the dry air of a summer that had brought little rain. Few people thought of this as unusual. Summers came and went. Fires broke out often enough, but they were usually contained. Buckets passed hand to hand. Neighbours rallied. Walls were torn down if necessary. London had systems, traditions and confidence. Authority in the city was equally familiar. The Lord Mayor, the aldermen, parish officials and watchmen formed a structure that had governed urban life for generations. The monarchy had only recently returned after years of civil war and upheaval. King Charles II sat on the throne again, and the nation was eager for stability. London, as the heart of commerce and politics, felt that stability most keenly. There was little appetite for alarm. The city wanted reassurance, not warnings. As Saturday turned into Sunday on the 2nd day of September, most of London slept. The river moved quietly past the wharves, carrying the smells of trade and tide. In homes above shops, families lay close together. In taverns, the last candles burned low. Watchmen called the hour, their voices steady and routine. Nothing in the air suggested that this night would be remembered for centuries. No bells rang, no orders were shouted. The city rested in its own familiarity. At a small bakery on Pudding Lane, near the river's edge, work had not long finished. Baking was done at night so bread could be sold fresh in the morning. Ovens were large, stubborn to cool, and built directly into wooden structures. The heat lingered even after the last loaf was drawn out. This was common knowledge, accepted as part of the trade. Bakers trusted their experience. They trusted that embers would die down as they always had before. The broader city trusted in routine just as deeply. Fire engines, which were essentially water-squirting pumps on wheels, were stationed at intervals. Parish buckets were hung in churches. Leather buckets were kept ready in many homes. All of this created a sense that risk was managed. London was not careless, but it was accustomed. Familiar dangers rarely feel urgent. Beneath this calm, though, conditions had quietly aligned. The summer had been unusually dry. Wooden beams had lost their moisture. Roofs were brittle. The river was low. Wells were not as full as usual. Strong easterly winds had begun to stir, pushing inland from the coast. None of these facts seemed alarming on their own. Together, They formed a setting that few could recognize until it was too late. Social life in the city carried on without reflection. Traders prepared for the coming week. Carters planned early starts. Churchgoers expected Sunday sermons that would speak of moral order, not catastrophe. The memory of plague had taught people to fear disease more than fire. Flames, after all, were visible. They could be fought. Illness crept unseen. Fire seemed honest by comparison. There was also a psychological comfort in believing that disaster belonged to the past. The Great Plague had already marked this generation. To imagine another city-wide calamity felt excessive, almost unreasonable. Londoners were tired of fear. They wanted normality, and that desire shaped what they noticed and what they ignored. Even the physical soundscape of the city reinforced calm. The usual night noises continued, the river lapping, horses shifting in stables, distant laughter, a door closing somewhere. These sounds told the mind that everything was as it should be. No one listening from a window would have guessed that within hours these familiar noises would be replaced by cracking timber, falling stone, and a roar that would not stop for days. This is how the Great Fire of London truly begins, not with spectacle, but with comfort, with people trusting what they had always trusted, with systems that had worked just well enough in the past to dull imagination, with a city that had survived war, plague, and political collapse, and believed itself resilient by habit rather than by design. The fire, when it came, would expose not just flammable buildings but assumptions. It would reveal how authority hesitates under pressure, how communities behave when escape becomes the only plan, and how memory reshapes disaster after the smoke clears. But none of that was visible yet. At this moment, London was simply a city at rest, confident, crowded, and quietly vulnerable. As the night deepened, the wind continued its steady push through the streets. Embers cooled slowly in ovens. Timber frames held the warmth of the day. Somewhere in the dark, a small failure waited to matter. And around it, a city slept, unaware that it stood at the edge of the most destructive fire in its history. London before the flames was not a single place, but many places pressed together, layered by time, habit, and necessity. To understand how the fire would behave, one must first understand how the city lived. London, in 1666, was the largest city in England, and among the largest in Europe, yet it had grown without a guiding plan. Streets followed medieval property lines, Roman roads and paths worn into use long before anyone thought about traffic, sanitation, or emergency access. What worked for a town of tens of thousands had simply been stretched to accommodate hundreds of thousands. Most Londoners lived close to their work. Trades clustered together by tradition. Bakers, brewers, chandlers, coopers, and butchers often worked side by side, each relying on fire or heat in some form. Smiths kept forges burning. Brewers boiled vats. Soap makers rendered fats over open flames. These industries were not hidden away. They were woven directly into residential life. Above workshops were sleeping quarters. Behind shops were kitchens and storerooms. Fire was not an exception to daily life. It was the centre of it. Housing reflected both economic necessity and custom. Timber-framed buildings dominated much of the city. Wood was cheaper than stone and quicker to assemble. Houses were built tall rather than wide, sometimes 4 or 5 stories high, because land within the city walls was valuable. Each level often projected outward over the street, a design known as jettying. This gained interior space but narrowed streets below. In many places, neighbours on opposite sides of a lane could nearly touch hands from their upper windows. Roofs varied by district and wealth. Some were tiled, others shingled, and many older or poorer buildings still used thatch. While thatch had been discouraged after earlier fires, enforcement was uneven. Repairs were expensive, and landlords often delayed them. Tar and pitch were commonly used to weatherproof roofs and beams, adding another flammable layer. Inside the walls, floors were wooden, stairs narrow, and partitions thin. A fire starting on one floor could quickly move upward, drawn by heat and air currents like a chimney. The streets themselves offered little protection. They were narrow, winding, and often cluttered. Market stalls spilled into roadways. Goods were stacked outside shops. Carts, barrels, and refuse blocked movement. Open drains ran along the edges, carrying waste toward the river. These channels were essential for sanitation but useless for firefighting. Water for emergencies had to be drawn from wells, pumps, or the Thames itself, then carried by hand in leather buckets. Firefighting in London was a communal responsibility rather than a professional one. Each parish was expected to maintain basic equipment. This included buckets, hooks for pulling down burning structures, ladders, and sometimes rudimentary hand-pumped engines. These engines were heavy and slow, capable of spraying water only short distances. They worked best when fires were small and localized. Coordination across parishes was limited. There was no central fire authority, no unified command, and no standardized training. When fires broke out, the standard response relied on speed and judgment. Neighbours formed bucket lines. Church bells rang alarms. Officials assessed whether nearby buildings should be demolished to create fire breaks. This decision carried legal and financial consequences. Destroying private property, even to save the city, required authority and courage. Compensation was uncertain. Hesitation was common, especially if the fire did not appear immediately threatening. Social divisions further complicated the city's structure. Wealthier citizens lived in larger homes, often built with more stone, especially in newer areas. Poorer residents crowded into older districts, renting rooms in subdivided houses. Overcrowding was common. A single building might shelter several families, each cooking and heating separately. Privacy was limited. So was control. A careless spark in one household could endanger dozens. Religion shaped daily rhythms and physical space. Churches dotted the city, more than 100 within the walls alone. Parish boundaries defined community identity. Bells marked time, called worshippers, and warned of danger. Churches also stored firefighting equipment and records. Yet these same buildings, often large and roofed with timber, were themselves vulnerable. They stood as landmarks and symbols, but also as potential fuel. Commerce tied London tightly to the river. The Thames was the city's main artery. Goods arrived by boat and were unloaded at crowded wharves. Warehouses lined the banks, packed with oil, alcohol, sugar, hemp, spices, and textiles. Many of these materials burned readily. Barrels were stacked high, sometimes leaking. Narrow lanes ran from the river into the city, forming corridors that could channel both people and fire. The river provided water, but it was not easily used in emergencies. Access points were limited. Pumps existed, but pressure was weak. Drawing water took time, and moving it uphill into the city was laborious. In dry weather, wells could fail or run low. The idea that the river alone could save London from a major fire was more comforting than realistic. Governance added another layer of complexity. The City of London was governed separately from the Crown, with its own officials and traditions. The Lord Mayor held significant authority within the walls, but that authority was balanced by customs, property rights, and political caution. Decisions that affected merchants or property owners could provoke backlash. Order depended on cooperation as much as command. Beyond the city walls, suburbs had grown rapidly. These areas were even less regulated. Buildings were packed closely, often with little oversight. Many residents worked in the city but lived outside its formal jurisdiction. Fire did not recognize these boundaries, yet planning rarely accounted for how quickly danger could move between districts. Memory also shaped behaviour. London had burned before, many times, though never on the scale to come. Most fires were contained within a few buildings or a single street. People remembered these events as disruptions, not existential threats. The idea that fire could overwhelm the entire city felt abstract, almost theoretical. Experience had taught Londoners that fire was manageable. This belief influenced construction choices. Even after laws encouraged stone and brick, many builders continued to use timber where possible. Brick was heavier, more expensive, and slower to work with. Timber allowed flexibility and speed. Repairs after small fires were often made with the same materials that had burned before. Continuity mattered more than caution. Daily life reinforced this continuity. Mornings began early, markets opened at dawn, bakers worked through the night, alehouses filled by afternoon, candles burned from sunset to sleep. Oil lamps flickered in windows. Every one of these practices involved flame. Safety depended on habit and attention rather than technology. Most of the time, this worked. Weather conditions in late summer 1666 subtly undermined that balance. Weeks without rain dried beams and floors. Dust gathered. The air felt lighter, crisper. People welcomed the pleasant weather after years of sickness. Windows stayed open. Fires burned more efficiently. Wind moved more freely through the city's narrow passages. Yet no one walked the streets thinking of disaster. The city felt busy but ordinary. Merchants worried about prices. Apprentices worried about masters. Families worried about rent. These concerns filled the mental space that might otherwise have noticed risk. The city functioned as it always had, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. London, before the flames, was a place of resilience built on repetition. People trusted what had worked yesterday to work tomorrow. Structures stood because they had stood for generations. Systems endured because they had not yet failed catastrophically. This was not foolishness, but human economy of thought. Cities survive by assuming continuity. The tragedy that would follow did not arise from ignorance alone. It grew from the accumulated decisions of centuries, each reasonable in its own moment. Timber had been cheap. Streets had been widened only when absolutely necessary. Authority had evolved slowly, shaped by compromise. Firefighting had been adequate until it was not. As Sunday morning approached, the city remained arranged exactly as it had been the night before. The bakery ovens were part of a vast network of heat sources embedded in wood and habit. The wind moved through alleys shaped by medieval plots. The river sat below warehouses packed tight with goods. Every element was in place, though no one could see the pattern forming. London before the fire was not careless, but it was vulnerable in ways that only a catastrophe could reveal. It was a city built to live efficiently, not to fail safely. And as the night edged toward dawn, that distinction was about to matter in ways no one could yet imagine. A restless summer. The summer of 1666 settled over London with a persistence that people noticed but did not yet fear. It was warm, dry, and unbroken by the steady rains that usually softened the city by late August. Day after day passed beneath clear skies. The ground hardened. Wooden beams in houses already old and seasoned continued to dry. Roofs creaked slightly as temperatures shifted between day and night. These were small sensations, easy to ignore, folded into the ordinary discomforts of city life. Londoners spoke of the weather often, but without urgency. A fine summer was a blessing after years of hardship. Only recently, the city had begun to recover from the Great Plague of 1665. Entire households had been sealed indoors. Streets had fallen silent. The dead had been carted away under cover of darkness. Compared to that terror, a dry summer felt almost kind. People welcomed the warmth. They opened windows. They lingered outdoors longer than usual. Normal life, when it returned, felt precious. The memory of plague still shaped behaviour, even when people did not speak of it directly. Many families had lost relatives. Some neighbourhoods were quieter than before, not because houses stood empty, but because habits had changed. People avoided close contact when they could. Markets were busy again, but with an undercurrent of caution. Churches filled, though sermons often carried reminders of human fragility and divine judgment. This lingering awareness of mortality paradoxically dulled fear of other dangers. Disease felt unpredictable and invisible. Fire, by contrast, seemed straightforward and familiar. Politically, England was in a period of uneasy adjustment. The monarchy had been restored only 6 years earlier, after a long civil war and a brief experiment in republican rule. King Charles II ruled, but his authority rested on compromise. Old wounds had not fully healed. Religious divisions persisted. Suspicion of foreigners, particularly the Dutch and the French, simmered beneath the surface. England was at war with the Dutch Republic, and rumours travelled quickly through taverns and wharves. London, as the centre of trade and governance, absorbed these tensions daily. Merchants worried about shipping losses. Sailors brought news from abroad, often exaggerated or incomplete. Pamphlets circulated freely, speculating about enemies within and without. Anxiety existed, but it was diffuse, spread thinly across many concerns. No single threat dominated attention. Fire was not part of this conversation. The physical city reflected this mixture of confidence and strain. Repairs from the plague year were ongoing. Some houses had been abandoned temporarily and then reoccupied. Others had been hastily cleaned and patched. Maintenance was uneven. In many buildings, beams exposed during earlier repairs remained untreated. Sawdust and shavings from construction lingered in corners. These details mattered, though no one yet recognised how. Water levels in the Thames fluctuated with the season. By late summer, the river was lower than usual. Barges still moved goods efficiently, but access points along the shore were muddier and less convenient. Wells in certain districts yielded less water, though enough for daily needs. Again, these changes did not register as threats. The city had endured dry spells before. Wind patterns, however, began to shift in a way that would soon prove critical. An easterly wind settled over the region, steady rather than gusty. It was not violent enough to draw attention. It did not disrupt shipping or topple signs. It simply moved, hour after hour, channeling air through the city's narrow streets. People noticed breezes in alleys, doors that closed more firmly than expected, smoke that drifted horizontally rather than rising. These were curiosities, not warnings. The rhythm of work continued unchanged. Bakers prepared for busy Sundays. Brewers boiled large batches in anticipation of demand. Candlemakers rendered tallow. All of these trades relied on heat sustained over long periods. In cooler weather, fires were watched closely. In warm weather, fatigue and routine often dulled attention. Ovens were banked rather than extinguished. Ashes were raked out, but embers lingered. At night, the city glowed softly. Candlelight flickered behind shutters. Oil lamps marked taverns and inns. Sparks occasionally escaped chimneys, but this was common enough to be ignored unless it caused immediate trouble. Watchmen kept their rounds, calling the hours. Their presence reinforced a sense of order. Someone was always awake. Someone was always watching. Yet the watch was limited by habit. Watchmen were not trained to imagine disasters beyond their experience. Their task was to deter theft, note disturbances, and respond to visible problems. A small fire discovered early could be handled. The idea of a fire spreading beyond a few buildings was not part of their mental framework. Past experience did not support it. Cultural attitudes reinforced this narrow focus. Fires were often seen as moral events as much as physical ones. Sermons framed them as warnings or punishments, but rarely as systemic failures. If a house burned, someone must have been careless or sinful. This individual framing discouraged broader thinking about infrastructure or prevention. Responsibility was personal, not collective. The summer also carried symbolic weight. The year 1666 itself had stirred unease among some Londoners. Numbers held meaning, especially in a deeply religious society. The repetition of the digit 6 reminded certain preachers and pamphleteers of apocalyptic imagery from Scripture. These ideas circulated at the margins, discussed quietly or dismissed outright. Most people did not dwell on them. Life required attention to more immediate matters. Markets were crowded in late August. Grain arrived from the countryside, meat was salted and stored, wool and cloth moved steadily through warehouses. The city felt prosperous again, at least on the surface. This prosperity increased risk in subtle ways. More goods meant more storage meant more tightly packed buildings. More wealth meant more hesitation to destroy property, even in an emergency. The city government continued its routine business. Records were kept, taxes collected, minor disputes resolved. There was no sense of impending crisis. Officials trusted established procedures. Extraordinary measures require extraordinary justification, and nothing yet justified alarm. Families prepared for autumn. Clothing was mended, supplies were counted. Children returned to apprenticeships after summer lulls. The future extended forward in familiar lines. People planned weeks ahead, not hours. This temporal orientation shaped perception. Fires were sudden, but planning assumed stability. At the edges of the city, fields lay dry. Farmers worried quietly about harvest yields, but food supplies remained adequate. The countryside did not yet feel threatened. London's problems were London's own. Rural and urban lives intersected through trade, but risk did not travel as easily in the imagination. All of these factors combined to create a peculiar calm. Not peace exactly, but a sense that nothing truly new could happen. The city had been shocked enough. It deserved rest. This belief, unspoken but shared, lowered vigilance. The physical science of fire was poorly understood. People knew fire needed fuel and air, but concepts like radiant heat, ember travel, and firestorms were unknown. The idea that fire could generate its own wind, feeding itself as it spread, belonged to a future vocabulary. In 1666, fire was seen as linear, not exponential. It moved from one object to another. Stop it here, and it stops everywhere. This misunderstanding mattered. It shaped how quickly people responded, how seriously they took early signs, and how willing they were to sacrifice property for containment. The summer conditions transformed fire behaviour, but understanding lagged behind reality. As August ended and September approached, the city remained balanced on habit. The dryness deepened. The wind persisted. Work continued. Sleep came easily. Nothing in daily life signalled that these elements were converging toward catastrophe. The night of Saturday, September 1st, carried no special weight. Taverns closed as usual, families retired, bakers prepared for Sunday. The city exhaled into darkness, unaware that the ordinary conditions of that summer had quietly prepared London not just for a fire, but for a fire that would behave in ways no one had seen before. When the first flames appeared, they would not arrive as an interruption to calm, but as a continuation of it. The restless summer had already done its work. The city simply had not noticed. A small fire on Pudding Lane, in the very early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September, when London was at its quietest, the fire began in a way that would have seemed unremarkable had it been discovered in time. On Pudding Lane, a narrow street running down toward the Thames, stood the bakery of Thomas Farriner, the King's baker. The building was typical of its kind, timber-framed, tall, narrow, and closely pressed against its neighbours. The bakery occupied the lower floors. Above it were living quarters where the family slept. Like many such buildings, it combined work and home into a single vertical space. Baking was done overnight. The ovens were large and built to hold heat for many hours. Once fired, they could bake batch after batch without needing to be relit. At the end of work, the fire was usually raked out, the embers reduced, and the oven left to cool slowly. This was standard practice, repeated night after night across the city. It relied on experience rather than instruments. Bakers judged heat by feel, by colour, by habit. At some point after midnight, something went wrong. The exact moment cannot be known with certainty. What is clear is that embers remained hot enough to ignite nearby material. Whether a spark escaped the oven, whether ash was improperly disposed of, or whether heat transferred through brick into surrounding timber, the result was the same. Fire took hold in the structure of the building itself. At first, it was likely small, a smoulder rather than a blaze. Timber does not always burst into flame immediately. It chars, warms, and weakens before igniting fully. This slow beginning is part of what made the fire dangerous. It allowed the flames to grow unnoticed, feeding quietly on dry wood, pitch, and stored materials. The Fariner family was asleep, so were most of the neighbours. The street outside was dark and still. Watchmen passed at intervals, but unless flames or smoke were visible, there was nothing to draw attention. Inside the building, heat accumulated. Beams warmed. Air currents began to form within the vertical shaft of the house, drawing fresh oxygen upward. Fire, once established, creates its own movement. The structure of the building helped it along. By the time the fire broke visibly through the bakery, it had already strengthened. Smoke filled lower rooms first, then rose. The family woke to heat and choking air. Thomas Fariner, his children, and a servant attempted to escape. They fled upward rather than down, a common instinct when smoke blocks exits. The upper floors were hot, but the roof offered a chance. Fariner and his family managed to climb out onto neighbouring buildings and escape. A maid, however, did not. She became the first known fatality of the Great Fire, trapped by smoke and flame before help could arrive. Outside, flames began to show through windows and roof timbers. The fire, now visible, drew attention at last. Neighbours shouted alarms. The cry of "Fire!" echoed down the lane. People ran from their beds, pulling on clothes, grabbing buckets. The watch was alerted. Bells began to ring. All of this happened within minutes, but minutes mattered. Initial responses followed familiar patterns. Buckets were filled and passed hand to hand from nearby pumps or the river. Water was thrown onto the burning building. Hooks were used to try to pull down parts of the structure, but the fire had already gained a foothold inside the house. Water thrown from outside could not easily reach the heart of the blaze. The narrowness of Pudding Lane limited movement. Heat drove people back. The wind, steady from the east, began to play its part. It pushed flames toward the west, deeper into the city. Sparks lifted and landed on neighbouring roofs. These roofs, dry and often coated with pitch, caught quickly. What had been one burning building became two, then three. Local officials were summoned. The alderman of the ward was alerted. Word was sent to the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. At this early stage, the fire still appeared containable. Fires had started in bakeries before. They had been put out. The assumption that this one could be managed shaped decisions that followed. The most effective method for stopping a fire in a dense city was demolition. Pulling down houses ahead of the flames created gaps that fire could not easily cross. This required decisiveness and authority. It meant destroying property that was not yet burning. Owners often resisted. Officials hesitated, weighing responsibility and blame. When the Lord Mayor arrived, accounts suggest he underestimated the danger. The fire was active, but not yet overwhelming. Bloodworth reportedly expressed confidence that it could be handled. Whether this exact phrasing is accurate matters less than the mindset it reflects. The fire was seen as an incident, not a turning point. Permission to demolish nearby houses was delayed. Some minor efforts were made, but not at the scale needed. As a result, the fire continued to spread through adjacent buildings. Each new structure added fuel. Each collapse sent showers of sparks outward. The geography of Pudding Lane amplified the problem. It sloped down toward the river, allowing wind to funnel flames along its length. Buildings leaned inward, trapping heat. Fire climbed walls and leapt across gaps with ease. Water access was limited. The river was close, but moving water uphill into the blaze was slow and exhausting. As dawn approached, the fire grew brighter. Smoke thickened, rising into the morning air. The sky above the eastern city began to glow, an unnatural light that could be seen from farther away. People waking elsewhere in London noticed the smell first, then the sight. From a distance, it still did not look catastrophic. Fires were not unusual sights on the skyline. This one, though, was larger and more persistent. Efforts to contain the blaze continued, but coordination was poor. Parish boundaries complicated response. Equipment varied in quality. Some fire engines arrived, but their reach was limited. Heat warped wooden pump components. Hoses, where they existed, were short. Water evaporated before it could do much good. The fire's behaviour began to change as it grew. Heat generated strong updrafts. Fresh air was drawn in at ground level, feeding the flames. This effect intensified the fire rather than smothering it. Sparks travelled farther. Roofs ignited without direct contact. Fire no longer needed a continuous line of fuel. It could jump. Panic had not yet fully set in, but concern spread. Merchants near the river began to move goods as a precaution. Families closer to the fire gathered belongings. Carts appeared in the streets. Traffic increased. The narrow roads, already crowded, became more difficult to navigate. Still, there was hesitation to declare an emergency. The city had no formal mechanism for such a declaration. Response depended on individual judgment. Many hoped the fire would slow once it reached larger stone buildings or open spaces. Others assumed the wind would change. Hope filled the gaps left by uncertainty. As morning broke fully, the fire crossed Thames Street, igniting warehouses filled with oil, spirits, and combustible goods. This marked a critical escalation. These materials burned hotter and faster than ordinary household contents. Explosions sent debris into the air. The riverfront, once a potential resource, became another source of fuel. From this point, the fire was no longer confined to a single street or trade. It had reached the commercial heart of the city. Smoke spread widely. Ash began to fall in neighbourhoods miles away. The smell of burning filled the air. The initial failure to stop the fire on Pudding Lane would later be scrutinised in detail. People would ask why houses were not pulled down sooner, why authority hesitated, why warnings were not heeded. At the time, these questions did not yet exist. Those involved were acting within the limits of their experience. The small fire that began in Farriner's bakery was not small because it lacked power, but because it began quietly. Its early stages offered a narrow window for control, one that closed rapidly as conditions aligned against the city. By mid-morning, that window was gone. The fire moved westward, driven by wind and fuel, leaving behind a trail of collapsed buildings and glowing embers. Pudding Lane, the point of origin, was already unrecognisable. What had been a working street of shops and homes became a line of smoking ruins. For the city as a whole, this was still only the beginning. The fire had revealed how quickly ordinary life could be overturned. It had exposed weaknesses in response and understanding. But London had not yet grasped the scale of what lay ahead. The spark on Pudding Lane did not announce itself as history. It behaved like many small fires before it, until it did not. And in that difference lay the fate of the city. Confusion at dawn. As daylight spread across London on the morning of Sunday, September the 2nd, the fire entered a new and more dangerous phase, not because it suddenly became more violent, but because it became more visible, and visibility brought confusion rather than clarity. From rooftops and upper windows across the city, A column of smoke could now be seen rising from the eastern districts. It darkened the pale morning sky and drifted westward, carried by the same steady wind that had fueled the flames through the night. For many Londoners, this was the first moment they became aware that something unusual was happening. At street level, the city woke unevenly. In areas far from Pudding Lane, shops opened as they usually did on a Sunday morning. Church bells called parishioners to early services. Bakers elsewhere delivered bread. Carts rolled through narrow streets. The rhythms of ordinary life persisted, even as smoke thickened in the air. People noticed the smell, sharp and persistent, but smell alone did not yet signal catastrophe. London often smelled of smoke. Hearths, forges, and kilns ensured that. Closer to the fire, however, the situation deteriorated quickly. Thames Street, densely packed with warehouses and wharves, was now fully involved. Barrels of oil, pitch, and spirits burned intensely. Flames rolled along the riverfront, licking at wooden piers and sending heat shimmering across the water. Attempts to fight the fire from boats proved dangerous and largely ineffective. Sparks leapt from building to building, carried farther by rising heat and wind. The fire no longer advanced only along streets. It jumped across them. Officials arriving on the scene struggled to assess what they were seeing. Fires were usually evaluated by size and location. This one defied easy measurement. It spread in multiple directions at once. Some streets appeared safe while others collapsed into flame within minutes. Smoke obscured sightlines. Noise made communication difficult. Orders, when given, were often misunderstood or delayed. Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor, remained responsible for authorising large-scale demolitions. His authority was clear in theory, but constrained in practice. Destroying houses meant immediate economic loss and the certainty of anger from property owners. Compensation mechanisms were unclear. Past incidents had taught officials to be cautious. At dawn, with the fire still spreading but not yet visibly uncontrollable, that caution prevailed. Reports circulated that the fire might burn itself out once it consumed available fuel. Others suggested it would slow when it reached stone buildings or open spaces. These ideas reflected past experience, not current conditions. The warehouses along Thames Street ensured a continuous supply of combustible material. Narrow lanes acted as channels for wind. Stone walls cracked and failed under sustained heat, allowing fire to pass through rather than stop. Firefighting efforts intensified but remained fragmented. Parish engines were deployed where possible. Buckets moved constantly, though fatigue set in quickly. Water sources became congested. People waited their turn at pumps while flames advanced elsewhere. Coordination across parishes was minimal. Each group focused on its immediate surroundings, unaware or unable to respond to developments beyond their line of sight. As morning progressed, traffic increased. Residents from threatened areas began to move belongings preemptively. Carts appeared loaded with furniture, bedding, tools and goods. Streets clogged. Movement slowed. Fire engines struggled to get through. In some cases, people abandoned firefighting to save their own property. This was not selfishness, so much as a rational response to uncertainty. Without clear direction, individuals acted for their families first. Rumours spread faster than reliable information. Some claimed the fire had already reached St. Paul's Cathedral. Others said it had been deliberately set. Whispers of foreign agents circulated, fueled by wartime fears. None of these rumours were accurate at this stage, but they shaped behaviour. Suspicion grew, cooperation weakened. The Lord Mayor's authority continued to erode as the scale of the problem became clearer. Requests for permission to demolish buildings increased. Each delay allowed the fire to gain ground. In some instances, residents took matters into their own hands, pulling down small structures without official sanction. These efforts were inconsistent and often too limited to matter. By mid-morning, the fire had spread beyond the original parish. It moved westward along Thames Street and began to push northward into the city proper. This marked a psychological shift. Fires along the riverfront were serious but often contained. A fire advancing inland threatened the commercial and civic heart of London. The danger now extended beyond warehouses to homes, churches and markets. King Charles II was informed of the situation as reports reached Whitehall. At first, information was incomplete and contradictory. Distances were underestimated. Speeds were misjudged. Advisers struggled to convey urgency without overstatement. The king, experienced enough to recognise the potential for disaster, began to take a more direct interest. However, the City of London retained formal control over its own affairs. Royal intervention required careful navigation of jurisdiction. Within the city, confusion deepened. Some officials ordered evacuations. Others advised people to stay put. Bells rang in some parishes and not in others. Smoke reduced visibility to such an extent that orientation became difficult. Streets once familiar now felt altered. People took wrong turns. Carts overturned. Horses panicked at the heat and noise. The fire itself behaved unpredictably. In some places it paused, consuming a cluster of buildings before advancing. In others it surged ahead, igniting roofs seemingly at random. This irregularity made planning difficult. Fire breaks created in one area proved useless when the fire bypassed them entirely by leaping through the air. Emotional responses varied. Some Londoners acted with remarkable calm, methodically moving goods and assisting neighbours. Others froze, overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. The absence of a single authoritative voice contributed to this range of reactions. No one could say with confidence what would happen next. Churches, traditionally places of refuge, filled quickly. People brought valuables and sought shelter, assuming thick walls would provide safety. Clergy struggled to manage crowds. Some churches attempted to protect nearby buildings by focusing firefighting efforts there, while others prepared for the possibility of evacuation. Economic concerns complicated decision-making. Merchants hesitated to abandon warehouses filled with valuable stock. Insurance, as a concept, was limited and inconsistent. Losses would be personal and immediate. This hesitation kept people in danger longer than was wise and delayed broader retreat. As the sun climbed higher, the fire showed no sign of slowing. Instead, it grew brighter and louder. The roar of burning intensified. Heat could be felt at greater distances. Ash fell steadily, settling on clothing and hair. The sky darkened despite the daylight, creating an eerie, muted atmosphere. By late morning it became clear to many that traditional methods were failing. Yet acknowledgement did not immediately translate into effective action. Authority remained divided. Resources were stretched thin. Experience offered no guide for a fire of this size and behaviour. The confusion at dawn was not simply a failure of leadership or courage. It was the collision of old assumptions with new reality. London's systems had been designed for familiar problems. This fire was not familiar. It moved faster, burned hotter, and spread farther than anything in living memory. As the city struggled to adjust, valuable hours slipped away. Each delay allowed the fire to entrench itself more deeply. By the time decisive measures were finally considered, the opportunity for easy containment had passed. The morning of September 2nd ended not with resolution, but with the growing realization that London faced something unprecedented. The city had awakened to a crisis it did not yet understand, and confusion more than flame alone would shape the course of the next terrible days. Fire meets wind. By the afternoon of Sunday, the fire and the wind had fully discovered each other, and once they did, the character of the disaster changed again. What had begun as a spreading blaze now behaved as a moving force, shaped less by human effort than by weather and structure. The easterly wind, steady since the night before, did not weaken as the day wore on. Instead, it pressed consistently into the burning districts, feeding oxygen into the flames and pushing heat westward through the dense fabric of the city. The wind mattered not only for its strength but for its direction. From the east, it drove the fire directly toward the heart of London. Streets that ran roughly east to west became channels. Flames advanced along them with alarming speed, while sparks lifted high and landed far ahead of the visible fire line. This behaviour confused observers. Fires were expected to spread from building to building, not to appear suddenly on distant rooftops. Yet that is exactly what happened. Roofs ignited without warning. A house that seemed safe moments earlier could burst into flame as embers settled into dry thatch or lodged in cracks between tiles. People attempting to defend their homes found themselves surrounded from multiple sides. Water thrown onto one wall did nothing to stop fire arriving from above. Buckets emptied faster than they could be refilled. The sound of the fire changed as well. Instead of the crackle of burning wood, there was now a constant roar, deep and sustained. It was the sound of many structures burning at once, of air rushing inward and upward, of collapsing timbers and exploding barrels. Conversation became difficult. Shouted orders were lost. Bells rang, but their messages blurred together. Heat intensified across a wide area. People several streets away felt it on their faces. Metal fixtures grew hot to the touch. Windows cracked. Even stone buildings suffered as mortar weakened and walls fractured. The assumption that stone offered complete protection began to fail under these conditions. Fire engines proved increasingly ineffective. Their short range meant operators had to move dangerously close to the flames. Leather hoses, where they existed, dried and stiffened in the heat. Water streams evaporated before reaching their targets. In some cases, engines themselves caught fire. Crews abandoned them, retreating as flames closed in. The wind also affected smoke behaviour. Instead of rising straight upward, smoke was driven low and fast through streets. Visibility dropped sharply. People lost their sense of direction. Familiar landmarks disappeared behind thick, choking clouds. Breathing became difficult, especially for the elderly and children. Those who lingered too long near the fire found themselves overwhelmed by smoke rather than flame. As conditions worsened, movement became chaotic. Streets filled with carts, wheelbarrows, and people on foot. Some tried to flee westward, away from the fire's advance, only to find roads blocked or impassable. Others turned north, hoping to escape laterally, but found flames already cutting off routes. The city's layout, once merely inconvenient, now became dangerous. The wind carried burning debris into open spaces that might otherwise have served as refuges. Churchyards, small squares, and market areas caught fire as embers settled among wooden stalls and sheds. These spaces, instead of slowing the fire, became new points of ignition. Fire breaks created earlier lost their effectiveness as flames leapt across them. Along the riverfront, the situation grew more volatile. Warehouses storing oil, tar, brandy, and other flammable goods burned with intense heat. Barrels burst, sending flaming liquid across streets and into the river itself. For a time, the Thames appeared to burn, its surface dotted with floating fire. Boats attempting rescues or firefighting had to pull back. The river, which many had assumed would act as a natural barrier, failed to contain the fire's influence. While flames did not cross the Thames in the same way they cross streets, heat and sparks threatened vessels and structures on both banks. Smoke spread far downstream. The sense of safety the river provided was psychological rather than practical. As the afternoon progressed, the fire reached increasingly prominent areas. Shops, homes, and churches fell in rapid succession. Each collapse added to the intensity of the blaze. Falling buildings released stored heat and fuel, creating surges that overwhelmed nearby efforts at control. The behaviour of the fire puzzled and frightened observers. It did not respect boundaries or expectations. Attempts to predict its path failed repeatedly. This unpredictability undermined morale. People accustomed to managing risk through experience found themselves without guidance. authority struggled to reassert itself. Orders were given to widen fire breaks, but execution was slow. Tools were scarce. Labourers were exhausted. Some residents resisted the destruction of their homes, clinging to the hope that the fire might spare them. Others had already fled, leaving empty structures to burn unchecked. By late afternoon, it was clear that traditional firefighting was no longer the primary means of response. The scale of the fire demanded drastic measures, yet coordination remained difficult. The Lord Mayor's earlier hesitation now carried consequences. With each passing hour, the fire's momentum increased, while the city's ability to respond diminished. King Charles II, recognizing the severity of the situation, began to take a more active role. Royal messengers moved between Whitehall and the city, carrying instructions and reports. The king urged decisive action, including the use of gunpowder to demolish buildings ahead of the fire. This advice, while sound, faced practical obstacles. Gunpowder was not readily available in large quantities within the city. Using it required expertise and courage. The wind showed no sign of relenting. Instead, it continued its steady push, hour after hour, shaping the fire's advance. Night approached again, bringing with it new dangers. Darkness would reduce visibility further, while wind and heat remained constant. Fatigue weighed heavily on everyone involved. As evening fell, the fire's glow illuminated the sky across much of London. People miles away could see it, a vast shifting light that turned night into a dim, flickering day. Ash fell like snow, coating roofs and streets. The smell of burning was everywhere. For those still near the fire, survival became the only goal. Organised response gave way to individual decisions. Families separated in the rush to escape. Possessions were abandoned. The city's social fabric, woven over centuries, began to tear under the strain. Fire and wind together created a force greater than either alone. The wind fed the fire, and the fire altered the wind, drawing it inward and upward, intensifying its own spread. This feedback loop was not understood at the time, but it was felt. People spoke later of being pushed by hot air, of flames seeming to move with purpose. By the end of Sunday, London was no longer facing a fire in the ordinary sense. It faced a moving front of destruction, advancing faster than people could retreat and consuming more than anyone had believed possible. The wind remained its ally, and until that alliance was broken, the city had little hope of stopping the flames. The realization settled slowly and unevenly. London was not simply burning. It was being reshaped by fire and air together, and the outcome was no longer under human control, leadership under strain. By the second night of the fire, leadership in London was no longer a matter of titles or formal authority, but of endurance under pressure. The city's governing structures, designed for routine administration and familiar emergencies, now faced a crisis that moved faster than orders could be written and spread wider than jurisdictional boundaries. Decisions that once unfolded over weeks were demanded in minutes. The strain exposed not only individual weaknesses, but systemic limits that had been invisible in calmer times. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, remained the central figure within the City of London's formal response. His office carried the legal authority to order the demolition of buildings, a power that had become crucial as the fire advanced. Yet that authority had been built for restraint, not urgency. Bloodworth was accustomed to balancing competing interests: merchants, property owners, aldermen, and guilds. His role required caution and consensus. In the face of a rapidly spreading fire, those instincts became liabilities. Throughout Sunday and into Monday, requests for decisive action multiplied. Aldermen from threatened wards pressed for permission to pull down houses ahead of the flames. Firefighters and watchmen reported that narrow streets and closely packed buildings made containment impossible without large fire breaks. Each request placed Bloodworth in the same position: authorise destruction now and face immediate backlash, or delay and hope the fire slowed on its own. The weight of that responsibility grew heavier as the consequences of earlier hesitation became clear. Houses that might have been sacrificed early to save entire districts were now fully involved in the blaze. The economic cost of delay increased with each hour, yet the political cost of action also grew. The more widespread the fire became, the more property owners were affected, and the louder their objections. Bloodworth's personal endurance was also tested. Accounts from the time describe him as overwhelmed and exhausted, moving through smoke-filled streets, confronted by desperate residents and conflicting reports. Whether he truly uttered dismissive remarks about the fire being easily put out matters less than the broader truth. He did not fully grasp the scale of the disaster until it had already exceeded his ability to manage it. Leadership failure in this context was not simply individual. The City of London had no standing emergency council capable of overriding normal procedures. Authority was fragmented among parishes, wards, and guilds. Communication relied on messengers moving through crowded, smoke-filled streets. There were no centralised maps, no real-time reports, no way to see the whole city at once. Each decision was made with partial information. As the fire spread westward, it moved beyond the areas most familiar to city officials. New neighbourhoods with different layouts and populations came under threat. Some officials focused on protecting symbolic landmarks or economically vital areas, while others prioritised residential districts. Without a unified strategy, efforts pulled in different directions. The strain of leadership was visible in how orders were given and received. Instructions to demolish buildings were sometimes vague, specifying general areas rather than exact structures. Those tasked with carrying out the orders hesitated, unsure which houses to pull down and how far to go. In some cases, demolition began only to be halted by protests from owners or counter-orders from other officials. This inconsistency reduced the effectiveness of fire breaks. Fear of blame loomed large. Officials understood that decisions made under pressure would be judged later, once the crisis had passed. Destroying private property without clear legal protection risked lawsuits, political retaliation, and damage to reputation. This fear encouraged delay, even when delay clearly worsened the situation. The arrival of royal attention altered the balance slightly. King Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York, recognised the danger sooner than many city officials. From Whitehall, they received increasingly alarming reports. The glow of the fire was visible from the royal residence. Smoke drifted across the Thames. The scale of the blaze could no longer be minimised. James, who would later become King James II, took an active role on the ground. He moved among the firefighting efforts, issuing instructions and encouraging the use of gunpowder to create fire breaks. His presence lent authority to actions that might otherwise have been contested. Royal backing reduced some resistance from property owners, though it did not eliminate practical difficulties. The king himself issued orders urging decisive demolition. However, royal authority within the City of London was not absolute. The city guarded its privileges carefully. Cooperation required negotiation as much as command. In the midst of an advancing fire, this constitutional complexity slowed response. Leadership strain was also evident among lower-level officials. Parish officers, watchmen, and constables faced impossible choices. They were responsible for maintaining order, yet order itself was dissolving. Evacuations were chaotic. Theft increased as abandoned houses stood open. Accusations flew, particularly against foreigners and outsiders. Maintaining calm became as difficult as stopping the fire. Some leaders rose to the occasion despite these challenges. Individuals took initiative where formal structures failed. Groups of men organised ad hoc demolition teams. Others coordinated bucket lines across parish boundaries. Clergy opened churches for shelter and storage, despite the risks. These efforts, while courageous, were limited in scope. They could not substitute for coordinated city-wide strategy. Fatigue compounded every problem. Leadership required constant presence, but sleep was scarce. Smoke irritated eyes and lungs. Heat drained strength. Decision-making suffered as exhaustion set in. Errors multiplied. Orders contradicted one another. People forgot details or misunderstood instructions. The psychological toll was significant. Leaders were confronted daily with loss and fear, not as abstract concepts but as faces and voices. Residents begged for permission to save their homes. Others demanded action to protect their livelihoods. Some accused officials of favoritism or incompetence. Each encounter added pressure. As Monday wore on, the fire continued to advance, and leadership structures continued to fray. Bloodworth's capacity to direct events diminished. At some point, he reportedly withdrew, physically and effectively, leaving others to act. Whether through illness, exhaustion, or despair, his absence created a vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped royal authority more decisively. James and other nobles took on greater responsibility for directing demolitions and coordinating efforts. Military resources, including trained men and access to gunpowder, were brought into play. These actions came late, but they marked a turning point in how the response was organised. The contrast between early hesitation and later decisiveness would become a central theme in accounts of the fire. Critics would argue that stronger leadership at the outset could have saved much of the city. Defenders would point to the unprecedented nature of the disaster and the constraints under which officials operated. Both views contained truth. Leadership under strain revealed the limits of governance built for stability rather than crisis. London's leaders were not uniquely flawed. They were products of a system that assumed emergencies would resemble the past. When reality diverged sharply from experience, adaptation was slow. By the end of the second day, it was clear that authority alone could not stop the fire. Leadership now focused on mitigation rather than prevention, slowing the spread, protecting key areas, and preparing for the aftermath. This shift marked a sobering acceptance of loss. The fire continued to burn, but the nature of leadership began to change. Responsibility spread outward, shared among royal figures, local officials, and ordinary citizens, acting beyond formal roles. The city's survival would depend less on individual leaders and more on collective endurance. In this crucible, leadership was stripped of ceremony and reduced to action under pressure. Titles mattered less than decisions. Tradition mattered less than speed. The Great Fire forced London to confront not only physical vulnerability, but the fragility of the systems meant to protect it. King and court respond. As the fire tightened its grip on London, the distance between the royal court and the burning city collapsed. What had begun as a civic emergency became a national one, not through proclamation, but through sight and proximity. From Whitehall, King Charles II could see the smoke rising in a vast, shifting column. By night, the sky glowed to the east, a restless light that refused to dim. Reports arriving at court grew more urgent, less orderly, and more troubling with each hour. It was no longer possible to treat the fire as a local problem to be managed by city officials alone. The King's Court was itself a place shaped by recent upheaval. Charles II had returned to the throne only 6 years earlier, after long exile and civil war. His authority rested on careful balance between Crown and Parliament, between royal prerogative and civic independence. The City of London was especially protective of its privileges. Intervention had to be handled delicately, even in crisis. Yet the scale of the fire forced a reconsideration of these boundaries. Charles II was not a distant monarch. He was practical, observant, and more experienced in adversity than his reputation for leisure might suggest. He had seen cities damaged by war. He understood logistics, movement, and the value of decisive action. As the fire spread beyond Thames Street and into the core of the city, he recognised that hesitation would only deepen the loss. The Duke of York, James, his brother and heir, shared this assessment and acted even more directly. James took on an active, visible role, moving into the city to oversee firefighting and demolition efforts. His presence mattered. Royal authority, embodied in a figure on the ground, cut through disputes that had stalled local decision-making. Where city officials hesitated, royal orders carried weight. At court, discussions shifted rapidly from observation to response. Advisors debated how far royal authority could and should extend. There was concern about precedent. Overriding city governance could provoke resentment or political backlash later, but the fire did not pause for constitutional reflection. Each hour of debate translated into more buildings lost. Charles II issued instructions urging the aggressive use of fire breaks, including the demolition of houses ahead of the flames. Gunpowder, stored in limited quantities within the city, was identified as the most effective means to achieve this quickly. Orders were sent to secure supplies from the Tower of London and other military stores. Trained personnel were dispatched to handle explosives safely. This marked a shift from civilian to quasi-military response. Soldiers, accustomed to discipline and rapid execution of orders, were better suited to coordinated demolition than ad hoc civilian groups. Their involvement also reassured some residents that action was being taken at the highest level, though it alarmed others who feared uncontrolled destruction. The court also confronted the human dimension of the disaster. Reports described families fleeing with what they could carry, crowds gathering in open fields, and churches filling beyond capacity. Charles II authorized relief measures where possible, instructing officials to provide food and temporary shelter to those displaced. These measures were limited by logistics and speed, but they signaled royal concern. Communication between court and city remained imperfect. Messengers struggled to move through congested streets. Smoke obscured landmarks. Reports arrived late or incomplete. Decisions were made with imperfect information. Still, the presence of a central coordinating authority began to impose some order on the chaos. James's role on the ground became especially significant. He coordinated demolition teams, supervised the use of gunpowder, and encouraged cooperation across parishes. His actions were pragmatic rather than ceremonial. He listened to reports from firefighters and labourers, adjusted plans, and pressed forward despite resistance. This hands-on leadership contrasted sharply with earlier indecision. Royal involvement also helped address one of the most paralysing obstacles: fear of blame. Property owners were more willing to accept the destruction of their buildings when orders came directly from the Crown. While anger and grief remained, responsibility was no longer diffuse. Decisions carried the weight of national authority. The king's engagement extended beyond immediate firefighting. He began to consider the aftermath even as the fire burned. Advisors discussed how the city might be rebuilt, how order might be maintained once the flames subsided, and how to prevent similar disasters in the future. These conversations did not yet produce concrete plans, but they reflected an understanding that the fire marked a turning point. At court, religious interpretations of the fire circulated alongside practical concerns. Some saw it as divine judgment, others as a natural disaster exacerbated by human error. Charles II, though a man of faith, tended toward practical explanations. He did not frame the fire as a moral spectacle, but as a problem to be solved. This outlook influenced the tone of royal response. The court also had to manage public perception. Rumours of arson and foreign sabotage spread rapidly. In a city already anxious about war with the Dutch, these rumours threatened violence against perceived outsiders. Charles II issued proclamations urging calm and discouraging attacks on foreigners. Maintaining order was as important as stopping the fire. As Monday night turned into Tuesday, the effectiveness of royal intervention began to show. Large-scale demolitions, coordinated and decisive, created wider fire breaks than earlier efforts. In some areas, the fire slowed or stopped entirely when it reached these gaps. The wind continued to drive flames elsewhere, but momentum was no longer entirely one-sided. The court's response was not flawless. Supplies were limited. Coordination took time. Some orders arrived too late to save key districts. Yet the contrast with earlier stages was clear. Where leadership had been hesitant, it was now assertive. Where authority had been fragmented, it was increasingly centralized. This shift also altered the psychological landscape. People began to believe that the fire could be contained, even if much had already been lost. Hope returned cautiously, not as optimism, but as the possibility of an end. This belief mattered. It encouraged continued effort, reduced panic, and restored a measure of cooperation. Royal involvement did not erase tensions between city and crown, but it reframed them. In crisis, boundaries blurred. The fire forced a temporary unity of purpose that peacetime politics often undermined. This unity would not last indefinitely, but in these days it proved essential. Charles II's personal engagement would later shape how the fire was remembered. Accounts emphasized his presence, his concern, and his decisiveness. Whether these accounts were embellished matters less than the role they played in restoring confidence. A monarch seen to act in disaster reinforced the legitimacy of the restored monarchy itself. The court's response also highlighted the limits of centralized power. Even with royal authority, the fire could not be commanded at will. Weather, structure, and chance still ruled. The crown could influence outcomes, but not dictate them. This recognition tempered expectations and guided strategy toward containment rather than total control. By the time the fire began to lose strength, the court was fully engaged not only in response, but in preparing for governance after disaster. Plans for relief, rebuilding, and inquiry took shape even as smoke lingered. The king understood that how the crown acted next would shape loyalty and memory for generations. In stepping into the crisis, the court altered the trajectory of the disaster and the relationship between ruler and city. The Great Fire became not just a test of urban resilience, but of monarchy itself. The response of king and court did not prevent devastation, but it helped transform chaos into recovery. As flames continued to burn, the presence of royal authority provided structure amid destruction. It marked the moment when the fire ceased to be solely London's burden and became a national concern. That shift would have lasting consequences, both for the city and for the kingdom that claimed it as its heart. Ordinary Londoners flee. By the time the fire had entered its third full day, it was no longer leadership, weather, or strategy that defined the experience of the Great Fire for most people. It was movement. London itself seemed to be on the move, flowing outward from the centre like water spilling from a broken vessel. The fire advanced, but ahead of it travelled fear, urgency, and exhaustion, carried by tens of thousands of ordinary Londoners doing what they had never imagined they would need to do, abandoning their city. For many, the decision to flee did not come suddenly. It arrived in stages, shaped by denial, hope, and the stubborn desire to believe that one's own street would somehow be spared. People listened for news, watched the sky, and judged distance by instinct rather than measurement. Smoke alone was not always enough to prompt flight. Flames had to be visible. Heat had to be felt. Only then did hesitation give way to action. Families packed what they could carry. This act revealed priorities more clearly than any speech could. Some chose bedding first, knowing sleep would be needed wherever they ended up. Others reached for tools, trade goods, or account books, hoping to preserve their livelihood. Clothing was bundled hastily. Food was taken when possible, though few thought far enough ahead to pack much of it. Valuables small enough to carry were hidden in pockets or tied into bundles. Large items were loaded onto carts if carts could be found. The streets filled quickly. What had once been busy thoroughfares became slow-moving lines of people, animals, and vehicles. Carts creaked under the weight of furniture. Horses strained. Oxen moved patiently through smoke and ash. Children walked beside adults or were carried when fatigue overtook them. Elderly relatives were helped along as best as possible. In many cases, Families separated unintentionally, losing sight of one another in the crowd. The city's narrow streets, never designed for mass evacuation, became obstacles. Bottlenecks formed where roads narrowed or where fallen debris blocked passage. Some people turned back, only to find alternative routes equally congested. Fire engines, demolition crews, and royal messengers all competed for the same limited space. Progress slowed to a crawl. Emotional strain mounted as movement became more difficult. People argued over right-of-way, tempers flared, accusations flew. Yet alongside this tension were countless small acts of cooperation. Neighbours helped lift loads. Strangers shared information about safer routes. Children were passed hand to hand across obstacles. The crisis exposed both friction and solidarity. Not everyone fled immediately. Some remained behind, guarding homes or shops as long as possible. Merchants stood watch over warehouses until flames were visible at their doors. Craftsmen hoped to save tools essential to their trade. Clergy attempted to protect churches or move sacred objects. These choices were not irrational. For many, leaving meant total loss. Staying offered at least the chance of preservation. As the fire spread, staying became increasingly dangerous. Smoke reduced visibility. Falling embers burned skin and clothing. Roofs collapsed without warning. The roar of the fire drowned out cries for help. Those who delayed too long sometimes found escape routes cut off. Panic replaced calculation. The movement outward took many directions. Some fled west, toward Westminster, and beyond. Others went north, toward fields and villages outside the city walls. Many crossed the Thames to the south bank, assuming the river would offer safety. Bridges became critical choke points. London Bridge, already lined with buildings, was especially dangerous, though it did not burn during this phase. Still, crossing took time, and crowds pressed forward anxiously. Open spaces outside the city filled rapidly. Fields, commons, and hills became temporary refuges. People camped where they could, laying out blankets or bedding salvaged from their homes. Carts formed makeshift shelters. The displaced clustered by parish when possible, seeking familiar faces and shared support. The city's social geography reassembled itself in exile. These camps were not orderly. Supplies were scarce. Food had to be purchased or begged for. Water sources were limited. Sanitation was poor. Yet compared to the inferno behind them, these hardships felt manageable. The priority was distance from the fire, not comfort. The psychological experience of displacement varied widely. Some people felt numb, moving automatically without fully processing what they were leaving behind. Others were visibly distressed, weeping openly as they watched smoke rise from neighbourhoods they might never see again. For many, the realization that their homes were likely gone arrived slowly, delayed by the sheer effort of escape. Children experienced the fire differently. Some were frightened by the noise and confusion. Others treated the journey as an adventure, at least at first, until fatigue and hunger set in. Parents struggled to maintain calm, knowing their own fear could spread quickly. Animals added another layer of complexity. Horses and oxen were essential for moving goods, but they were also vulnerable to panic. Smoke irritated their eyes and lungs. The smell of fire unsettled them. Keeping animals moving and under control required constant attention. When animals bolted, they caused accidents and injuries. Looting became a concern as neighbourhoods emptied. Abandoned houses stood open, their contents visible and tempting. Some theft occurred, though the extent was later exaggerated. Most people were too focused on survival to steal. Still, fear of looting kept some residents behind longer than was wise, guarding what little they could. Rumours flourished among the fleeing crowds. Stories spread of entire districts destroyed, of the fire reaching places it had not yet touched, of enemies setting new blazes ahead of the main front. These rumours increased anxiety and sometimes redirected movement unnecessarily. Without reliable information, imagination filled the gaps. The act of choosing what to take revealed deep social inequalities. Wealthier residents could afford carts, animals, and hired help. They moved larger quantities of goods and often travelled farther. Poorer Londoners carried what they could on their backs. Many owned little beyond clothing and basic tools. For them, loss was swift and total. Apprentices faced particular challenges. Bound to masters whose shops or homes burned, they suddenly found themselves without shelter or employment. Some stayed with masters' families. Others joined the crowds of displaced, uncertain of their obligations or future. Guild structures provided some support, but not enough for the scale of need. Women bore much of the practical burden of evacuation. They packed, organised, and cared for children and elderly relatives. In the camps, they sought food and water, tended to the sick, and tried to establish routines. Their labour was essential, but largely invisible in official accounts. Religious responses accompanied flight. Some prayed openly as they moved, interpreting the fire as divine judgment or trial. Others focused on practical matters, postponing reflection. Clergy offered comfort where they could, though many were themselves displaced. Churches outside the fire zone became centres of relief and organisation. The physical environment outside the city transformed rapidly. Areas that had been quiet fields now held dense populations. Paths became roads. Temporary markets sprang up as traders followed the crowds. Prices rose sharply. Food shortages threatened. Authorities attempted to regulate supplies, but enforcement was difficult. As night fell on successive days, the glow of the fire dominated the horizon. For those camped outside the city, it was impossible to ignore. The light flickered across faces and fields, a constant reminder of what had been left behind. Sleep was fitful. Smoke drifted even into these areas, stinging eyes and throats. For some, fleeing was temporary. They hoped to return as soon as the fire passed. For others, especially those whose homes were clearly lost, exile felt more permanent. The uncertainty weighed heavily. No one knew how long the fire would burn or what would remain afterward. Despite hardship, communities formed quickly. People shared food, information, and labour. Familiar social structures reasserted themselves. Parish groups organised care for the vulnerable. Informal leaders emerged. These adaptations demonstrated resilience, even in displacement. The experience of fleeing reshaped how Londoners understood their city. Streets once taken for granted became obstacles remembered in frustration. Districts became memories rather than places. The city, long defined by stability and habit, was now understood as fragile. The fire continued to advance behind them, but for those who had fled, the immediate struggle shifted from escape to endurance. They waited, watched, and listened for news. Each rumour carried hope or dread. Each change in wind direction mattered. Ordinary Londoners did not flee because they were cowardly or unprepared. They fled because the scale of the disaster exceeded anything they could fight. Their movement was not chaos, but adaptation under extreme pressure. It was the city responding as a living organism, redistributing itself to survive. This mass flight would leave lasting marks. It influenced how relief was organised, how rebuilding was planned, and how the fire was remembered. The image of Londoners camped in fields and villages, watching their city burn, became one of the defining memories of the Great Fire. In the midst of destruction, the act of fleeing preserved life. Buildings could be rebuilt, goods could be replaced, lives could not. The decision to leave, difficult and painful, was often the difference between survival and tragedy. As the fire continued its course, London existed in two forms at once: the burning city behind and the displaced city ahead. Both were London. Both carried its future, a city unmade. By the time the fire had reached its greatest extent, London was no longer a city in the ordinary sense. It had become a process rather than a place, an unmaking that unfolded street by street, hour by hour. What had once been fixed addresses, routes, neighbourhoods, lost their meaning as buildings collapsed and landmarks vanished. For those watching from a distance, the city appeared to dissolve into a broad field of flame and smoke. For those still within its reach, the experience was more intimate and more disorienting. The destruction did not arrive everywhere at once. It moved unevenly, shaped by wind, building density, and the materials stored within each district. Some streets burned fiercely and quickly, consumed in a matter of hours. Others resisted briefly, only to fall later when heat-weakened walls or embers found a way in. This irregular pace created a strange rhythm, moments of apparent calm punctuated by sudden collapse. Markets were among the first civic spaces to be lost. These were centres of daily exchange, crowded and noisy under normal conditions. Now they burned silently once abandoned, stalls collapsing inward as flames consumed their wooden frames. Goods that had been traded only days earlier, cloth, grain sacks, barrels of produce fed the fire in place. The loss was not only economic, but symbolic. Markets represented continuity and routine. Their destruction marked a break in the city's daily life. Homes followed. Rows of houses, packed tightly together, burned as units rather than as individual structures. Fire moved through shared walls and roofs, turning entire blocks into single burning masses. Interiors that had been private and familiar were exposed briefly before collapsing, revealing furniture, personal objects, and domestic spaces to the open air and then to flame. These fleeting glimpses underscored the intimacy of the loss. Shops and workshops burned alongside residences. Tools melted. Workspaces collapsed. Years of labour disappeared in moments. For craftsmen, this was not just the loss of property, but of identity. Trades were tied to place. Without a shop, a craft could not easily continue. The fire disrupted livelihoods as thoroughly as it destroyed buildings. Civic buildings fared little better. Guild halls, meeting places and offices fell as the fire advanced. Records kept for generations were lost. Charters, contracts and accounts burned, erasing institutional memory. This loss would complicate recovery, as claims of ownership and obligation could no longer be easily verified. Churches stood out against the flames, both physically and emotionally. Many were substantial structures, built with stone walls and timber roofs. For a time, these walls seemed to hold. People gathered around them, hoping they would serve as anchors in the chaos. But sustained heat proved relentless. Roofs caught fire, beams collapsed inward. Once a church was fully involved, the fire burned intensely, fueled by wood, furnishings and stored materials. The loss of churches struck deeply. These buildings were not only places of worship, but centres of community identity. Parish boundaries defined social life. Bells marked time and danger. When a church burned, it felt as though a piece of the city's structure, both physical and social, had been removed. The soundscape of destruction was constant and overwhelming. Timber cracked and snapped as it burned. Roofs collapsed with dull thunder. Occasionally, sharper sounds cut through the roar as stored goods exploded or walls fell outward. These noises carried far, warning those ahead of the fire and reminding those behind of its approach. The visual transformation was equally striking. Smoke turned daylight into a dim, reddish haze. At times, the sun appeared as a dull disk. Its light filtered through ash. Shadows shifted unpredictably as flames flickered. Night offered no relief as the fire illuminated the city with a harsh, uneven glow. The boundary between day and night blurred. Heat altered perception. People near the fire described feeling pushed by waves of hot air. Clothing grew uncomfortably warm even at a distance. Metal objects burned skin on contact. This heat-shaped movement, forcing retreat even when flames were not yet visible. It created invisible barriers that guided the fire's path as surely as walls and streets. The riverfront, once a place of trade and activity, became a corridor of destruction. Warehouses burned fiercely, their contents producing intense heat. Piers collapsed into the Thames. The river reflected the flames, amplifying the spectacle. Boats crowded the water, some carrying people and goods away, others attempting to assist. Smoke hung low over the surface, making navigation dangerous. As districts fell, the map of London was effectively erased. Streets lost their names as reference points vanished. People attempting to navigate found themselves disoriented, even in areas they had known all their lives. This disorientation increased danger, trapping some and slowing others. The fire's progress exposed differences in construction quality and maintenance. Newer buildings, sometimes built with more brick, resisted slightly longer. Poorly maintained structures failed quickly. But these differences mattered little in the end. Sustained heat overcame most defences. The fire did not discriminate by wealth or status once it reached an area. The emotional impact of watching the city unmade was profound. Those who had fled earlier returned cautiously to observe from the edges. They searched for familiar landmarks in the smoke and flame, trying to locate where their homes had stood. Often, they could not. The absence itself became the most striking feature. Where a street should have been, there was only open space filled with debris and embers. For those still within the burning districts, survival depended on constant movement and awareness. Rest was nearly impossible. Decisions had to be made quickly and revised just as quickly. Paths thought safe minutes earlier became dangerous. The sense of control was minimal. Animals suffered alongside people. Livestock trapped in pens or stables perished. Pets were abandoned or lost in the chaos. Horses, essential for transport, were injured or exhausted. The presence of dead animals added to the distress and complicated movement through streets. The fire also altered the city's smells. The familiar mix of river, refuse and smoke was replaced by a harsher blend of burning wood, pitch, fabric and food. This smell lingered everywhere, clinging to clothing and hair, marking those who had been close to the fire even after they escaped. Time itself seemed distorted. Without regular bells or routines, days and nights blurred together. People measured time by the fire's movement rather than by clocks. Memory became fragmented. Later accounts would struggle to place events in exact sequence, reflecting how disorienting the experience had been. As destruction continued, the idea of saving the city gave way to saving parts of it. Efforts focused on protecting key areas that had not yet burned, using wide demolitions to halt the fire's advance. These measures would eventually succeed, but only after much had already been lost. The unmaking of London was not total. Some districts remained intact, but the core of the city, its commercial, civic and residential heart, was profoundly altered. The fire carved a vast scar through the urban fabric, one that would shape rebuilding for decades. This unmaking was not simply physical. Social networks were disrupted. Economic systems stalled. Governance was challenged. The city's identity, long rooted in continuity, was forced to confront rupture. Londoners would later speak of the fire as dividing time into before and after. As the fire raged, people began to grasp the scale of what was happening. Estimates of loss circulated, growing larger with each retelling. Numbers struggled to capture reality. How does one quantify the loss of familiarity, of memory embedded in place? The fire did not pause for reflection. It continued to consume, reshape, and erase. But even in this process of destruction, the foundations of recovery were being laid. The very emptiness left behind would make rebuilding possible in new ways. A city unmade is not simply destroyed, it is opened. Space appears where none existed. Old patterns are broken. What follows depends on choices made in the aftermath. For London, the unmaking was a prelude, though no one living through it could yet see what would come next. As the fire approached its limits, the city behind it was irrevocably changed. What remained standing did so by chance as much as design. The Great Fire had reduced London to its essentials: people, ground, and the will to begin again. St. Paul's in flames. For many Londoners, the moment when the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral marked the point at which disbelief finally gave way to acceptance. Up to that point, there had still been pockets of hope beliefs that certain buildings were too important, too solid, or too symbolic to fall. St. Paul's represented all of these at once. It stood not only as the spiritual heart of the city, but as a landmark visible from across London, a structure that had endured centuries of storms, neglect, repair and use. If anything could withstand the fire, many believed it would be St. Paul's. The cathedral that stood in 1666 was not the one familiar today. It was Old St. Paul's, a vast medieval building whose construction had spanned generations. Its stone walls were thick, its proportions immense. The nave was among the longest in Europe. The central spire, though damaged by lightning years earlier and replaced with a shorter structure, still dominated the skyline. To Londoners, St. Paul's was not merely a church, it was a gathering place, a reference point, a symbol of endurance. Its physical presence shaped expectations. Stone, after all, did not burn. This simple truth carried great weight in a city built largely of wood. As the fire advanced westward, many assumed that St. Paul's would act as a natural barrier, slowing or stopping the flames. This belief influenced decisions. Efforts to defend nearby areas were sometimes delayed or redirected in the assumption that the cathedral would hold. St. Paul's also became a place of refuge and storage. As the fire approached, people brought books, papers, furniture and goods into the cathedral, believing its walls would protect their possessions. Printers stored valuable stock there. Merchants deposited records. Parishioners carried items of personal significance. The cathedral's vast interior filled with objects meant to be saved. At the same time, repairs were underway on the building. Scaffolding surrounded parts of the exterior. Timber structures, erected to support maintenance work, clung to the stone walls. These additions, though temporary, would prove critical. They introduced fuel where little had existed before. The roof of Old St. Paul's was constructed largely of timber, covered with sheets of lead. This combination had protected the building from rain for centuries, but it concealed vulnerability. Beneath the lead lay dry wood, aged and weakened. The long, hot summer had dried it further. The cathedral's sheer size meant that once fire took hold, it would have room to spread internally. As the fire drew closer, sparks began to land on the cathedral's roof and scaffolding. At first they were brushed off or extinguished. Observers took comfort in these small successes. But the wind remained steady, and the volume of embers increased. Eventually one found a place to settle where it could not easily be reached. Accounts differ on the exact moment when St. Paul's caught fire. What is clear is that once ignition occurred, it was not immediately visible from the ground. Fire smouldered beneath the lead sheets, fed by timber below. This hidden phase delayed response. By the time flames broke through, the fire had already spread extensively. When the roof finally ignited, the effect was dramatic. Lead sheets heated rapidly, then began to melt. Molten lead flowed down the roof and into the streets below, a terrifying sight that underscored the intensity of the heat. The interior filled with smoke. Wooden furnishings, scaffolding and stored goods caught fire almost simultaneously. The scale of the blaze inside the cathedral shocked even those accustomed to the city's destruction. St. Paul's did not burn like a house or a shop, it burned like a contained furnace. The vast interior amplified heat. Air rushed in through doors and windows, feeding the flames. The fire roared upward into the roof space, consuming beams that had stood for centuries. Attempts to save the building continued briefly. People tried to remove stored goods. Firefighters directed water streams where they could, but access was limited and heat was overwhelming. Falling debris made entry dangerous. Within a short time it was clear that the cathedral could not be saved. The collapse of the roof marked the end. As timber supports failed, sections of the roof fell inward, sending showers of sparks and debris through the nave. Stone walls, though they did not burn, cracked under thermal stress. Windows shattered. The interior, once a place of order and reverence, became a chaos of flame and falling material. The emotional impact of St. Paul's burning was profound. For many Londoners, it felt as though the city itself was being erased. The cathedral had outlasted kings, plagues, and wars. Its destruction suggested that nothing was beyond the fire's reach. This realization spread quickly, carried by word of mouth and by the visible glow of the burning roof. People watching from a distance described the sight as both mesmerizing and horrifying. The scale of the building made the fire visible from miles away. At night, the burning cathedral dominated the skyline, a vast crown of flame. The image imprinted itself on memory and would later appear in countless accounts and illustrations. The loss of St. Paul's was not only symbolic, it had practical consequences. The cathedral housed records, libraries, and offices. Its destruction meant the loss of legal documents, ecclesiastical archives, and cultural materials accumulated over centuries. These losses complicated recovery and deepened the sense of rupture. The fire at St. Paul's also reshaped strategy. Any lingering belief that stone buildings could serve as safe havens or barriers was extinguished along with the roof. From this point forward, defence efforts focused less on individual structures and more on creating wide, empty spaces through demolition. For the clergy, the burning of the cathedral prompted intense reflection. Some interpreted it as a sign of divine judgment. Others saw it as a warning about human pride or neglect. Yet, amid these interpretations, practical concerns dominated. Parish organisation had to be re-established without its central landmark. Services would have to be held elsewhere. Community life would need new centres. The destruction of St. Paul's also influenced the king's resolve. Charles II reportedly watched the burning with deep concern. The loss underscored the scale of the disaster and reinforced the need for decisive action. It also planted the seed for rebuilding not just the city but its symbolic heart. As the cathedral burned, the fire continued to spread around it. Nearby streets and buildings were consumed in quick succession. The area that had once been among the most densely built in the city became an open expanse of rubble and embers. The skyline changed permanently. The aftermath of the burning was stark. When the flames finally died down, what remained of St. Paul's was a shell. Walls stood, blackened and cracked. The interior was open to the sky. The floor was buried under debris. The building was no longer usable in any meaningful sense. Demolition would later be required to clear the site. In the days following, Londoners returned to the ruins, drawn by grief, curiosity, or necessity. Many searched for belongings stored in the cathedral, though few found anything salvageable. The ruins became a place of mourning and reckoning. St. Paul's in flames became one of the defining images of the Great Fire. It symbolized loss, vulnerability, and the end of an era. Yet it also became a starting point. The decision to rebuild the cathedral would lead to one of the most ambitious architectural projects in England's history. At the time, however, such thoughts lay in the future. As Old St. Paul's burned, Londoners confronted the reality that their city's past could be erased in days. The fire did not merely destroy buildings, it severed connections to history, memory, and identity. The burning of St. Paul's marked the moment when the fire's meaning shifted. It was no longer just a disaster, it was a transformation. The old city was gone in a way that could not be repaired or patched. What would come next would have to be new. As flames subsided around the cathedral, smoke lingered, and ash settled over the ruins. The great stone walls stood in silence, bearing witness to their own survival and their own failure. Around them, London continued to burn and to change. The fire would eventually pass. Rebuilding would begin. A new St. Paul's would rise. But old St. Paul's, with all its accumulated history, had ended in flame. Its loss crystallized the great fire in the minds of those who lived through it and those who would remember it later. In that sense, St. Paul's did not simply burn. It marked the moment when London fully understood what it had lost and what it would have to become. Order through destruction. By the fourth day of the fire, a hard and unsettling truth had settled over London. The only way to save what remained of the city was to destroy parts of it deliberately. This idea was not new. Fire breaks had long been understood in theory, and small-scale demolitions had been used in earlier fires. What was new was the scale now required. The Great Fire had grown beyond any previous experience, and stopping it demanded destruction on a level that felt almost indistinguishable from the disaster itself. The logic was simple, even if the execution was not. Fire needs fuel. In a dense city built largely of wood, fuel was everywhere. The only reliable way to halt the flames was to remove that fuel completely, creating wide gaps that fire could not cross. These gaps had to be substantial. Narrow alleys or the removal of a single house would no longer suffice. Entire rows of buildings would need to come down. By this point, hesitation had largely given way to grim acceptance. Property owners, who might earlier have protested, now understood that delay meant total loss. Many were already homeless, their houses burned or burning. The question was no longer whether buildings would be destroyed, but which ones and by whom. Royal authority played a decisive role. Under the direction of the Duke of York and with the King's full backing, demolition efforts became more systematic. Soldiers joined civilian labourers. Gunpowder, brought from military stores, was distributed to teams trained to use it. This marked a significant shift. The response was no longer purely civic. It had become organised, forceful, and irreversible. Gunpowder was chosen because it could clear large areas quickly. Hooks and manual tearing were too slow for the conditions. Fire advanced faster than men with ropes and axes could work. Explosives allowed walls and entire buildings to be brought down in moments, creating open spaces before flames arrived. The danger of this method was obvious, but the danger of inaction was greater. The process was unsettling to watch. Buildings that still stood intact, some not yet touched by fire, were marked for destruction. Residents were ordered to clear out immediately if they had not already done so. Explosions echoed through the city, sharp and abrupt, distinct from the roar of flames. Walls collapsed outward, roofs fell inward, dust and debris filled the air. These controlled demolitions changed the soundscape of the fire. The continuous roar was now punctuated by sudden blasts. For those already displaced, the explosions confirmed that the city was being dismantled deliberately. For some, this brought relief. For others, it deepened the sense of loss. The destruction was now purposeful, not accidental. Creating effective fire breaks required planning under pressure. Teams had to choose locations where gaps would intersect the fire's likely path. Streets were widened by removing entire blocks. In some areas, large open spaces were carved out where dense neighbourhoods had stood. These spaces were raw and uneven, filled with rubble, but they served their purpose. The wind remained a challenge. Even wide gaps could be crossed by embers carried high into the air. For this reason, fire breaks had to be placed strategically, often in series. One break slowed the fire, several, aligned correctly, could stop it. This understanding emerged through trial and error, as some early breaks failed and others succeeded. Coordination improved as the necessity of order became clear. Military discipline helped. Orders were clearer. Chains of command were more direct. Civilians working alongside soldiers adapted quickly, guided by necessity rather than training. Exhaustion remained severe, but purpose sharpened focus. Not all demolitions went smoothly. In some cases, buildings collapsed in unexpected ways, blocking routes or creating new hazards. Fires ignited debris piles. Injuries occurred. Yet, compared to the scale of the fire itself, these incidents were limited. The overall effect of the demolitions was unmistakable. The fire's advance began to slow. One of the most critical areas was the approach to the western parts of the city and toward Westminster. Protecting these areas became a priority. Large fire breaks were cut aggressively. The destruction here was extensive, but it succeeded in preventing the fire from consuming even more of the capital. As the fire encountered these gaps, its behaviour changed. Flames reached the edges of open spaces and faltered. Without nearby fuel, fires burned down rather than spreading onward. Embers fell harmlessly onto bare ground or stone. The wind still pushed, but there was nothing left for it to feed. This moment marked the beginning of the end, though it was not immediately obvious. Fires continued to burn within contained areas. Ruins smouldered. Smaller outbreaks flared as embers found isolated fuel, but the unstoppable forward momentum was broken. For those overseeing the effort, the emotional cost of success was heavy. They had saved parts of the city by destroying others. Streets that might have survived if the fire had taken a different path were now gone by human decision. This moral weight would linger long after the flames were extinguished. Londoners who returned to observe the results of demolition struggled to reconcile the sight. Some neighbourhoods ended not in fire, but in sudden absence. Rows of houses stopped abruptly, replaced by open ground and shattered stone. It was destruction without the familiar marks of burning, and it felt strangely final. Yet there was also a sense of control returning. For the first time since the fire began, people could point to lines on the ground and say, with some confidence, that the fire would not pass beyond them. This certainty, however limited, restored a measure of calm. Order through destruction became the defining strategy of the fire's final phase. It was a harsh solution, born of necessity rather than choice. It reflected a shift in understanding, the recognition that preserving the whole required sacrificing parts, and that clinging to every building guaranteed the loss of all. As night fell again, the city no longer glowed uniformly. Large sections were dark, empty, and silent. Other areas still burned, but the fire was now contained within boundaries drawn by human hands. Smoke continued to rise, but the horizon no longer advanced. The Great Fire had forced London to accept a brutal lesson. Sometimes, survival requires deliberate loss. Sometimes, order can only be restored by tearing down what once seemed indispensable. By the time the final flames began to weaken, it was clear that these acts of controlled destruction had saved the Western city. Westminster remained intact. The seat of government was spared. London, though devastated, still existed. The scars left by these firebreaks would shape the city's future. They created opportunities for new streets, wider roads, and different planning. At the time, however, such possibilities were distant thoughts. What mattered was that the fire was finally being stopped. Order had been achieved, not through preservation, but through the courage to destroy in order to save. And with that difficult balance struck, London moved slowly toward the end of the fire and the beginning of reckoning. The fire fades. By the morning of Thursday, the 6th of September, the Great Fire of London had begun to exhaust itself. This was not a sudden ending, nor a moment that could be clearly announced. There was no single hour when the city knew the danger had passed. Instead, the fire weakened gradually, losing the relentless certainty that had defined its advance for days. What remained was heat without momentum, flame without direction, and a city that dared, cautiously, to believe that the worst was over. The change was first noticed in small ways. In areas where fire breaks had been cut wide and deep, flames reached the open ground and faltered. Without adjacent buildings to feed on, they burned downward rather than outward. Charred timbers collapsed into themselves. Roofs that might once have ignited now lay already destroyed or absent. Embers fell onto bare earth, stone or rubble, and died there, hissing briefly before going dark. The wind, so crucial to the fire's earlier power, began to ease. It did not vanish entirely, but its steady force weakened enough to break the destructive partnership that had carried the flames across the city. Smoke still drifted, but it no longer surged with the same urgency. The air felt different, heavy, stale, and thick with ash, yet calmer. Firefighters and labourers, exhausted beyond measure, continued their work with renewed focus. Instead of chasing advancing flames, they now patrolled boundaries, stamping out smaller outbreaks before they could grow. Buckets were used not to fight walls of fire, but to douse glowing beams and smoking debris. Watchfulness replaced desperation. The soundscape shifted noticeably. The roar that had filled the city, day and night, faded into something quieter and more fragmented. Instead of a continuous thunder of destruction, there were isolated cracks as weakened structures finally collapsed, and soft rushing sounds as smouldering ruins breathed out their last heat. For the first time in days, moments of relative silence appeared. These moments were unsettling. Londoners had grown accustomed to the noise of disaster. Silence felt unnatural, almost suspicious. People listened carefully, straining to determine whether the quiet signalled safety or merely a pause before renewed destruction. Gradually, confidence grew as hours passed without fresh surges of flame. Those who had remained on the outskirts of the fire zone began to edge closer. Cautious groups approached the ruins, stopping often to assess danger. The heat still radiated from the ground in many places. Smoke rose from cracks and piles of debris. It was not yet safe to move freely, but curiosity and necessity pulled people inward. The landscape they encountered was altered beyond recognition. Streets were no longer clearly defined. Familiar paths ended abruptly in fields of rubble. Charred beams lay tangled together, still warm to the touch. Stone walls stood alone, stripped of roofs and floors, like incomplete sketches of buildings that had once been whole. Fire continued to burn in pockets across the city. Some areas smouldered for days longer, hidden beneath debris where air still reached buried embers. These fires required constant attention. A careless step or a strong breeze could reignite destruction. The work of extinguishing the fire was not dramatic, but it was painstaking and essential. Officials began to take stock even before the fire was fully out. Messengers moved through safer districts, reporting which areas had burned and which remained intact. Rough boundaries of destruction were sketched out. These early assessments were imperfect, but they helped shape the next phase of response. The psychological shift was as significant as the physical one. Fear did not disappear, but it changed form. Instead of immediate panic, there was shock, grief, and fatigue. Londoners who had lived for days in constant motion now found themselves with nothing to do but wait and look. Many struggled to absorb what they were seeing. For those whose homes lay within the burned area, hope narrowed to fragments. They searched ruins for recognizable objects, bits of pottery, metal fittings, anything that might confirm where their lives had once been anchored. Most found little. Fire had erased boundaries between houses, mixing possessions into indistinguishable debris. Those whose homes had survived experienced a different tension, relief mixed with guilt. They knew how close destruction had come. They saw neighbours who had lost everything. Survival felt fragile, almost accidental. This awareness would shape how communities responded in the weeks to come. Religious reflection intensified as the fire faded. Services were held outdoors or in surviving churches. Clergy spoke to congregations gathered in unfamiliar places. Interpretations varied, but the dominant tone was sober rather than triumphant. Survival was not framed as victory, but as responsibility. King Charles II and his advisers moved more openly through the city, inspecting damage and speaking with officials. Their presence signalled transition. The emergency phase was ending. Governance and recovery would now take precedence. Orders shifted from demolition to stabilisation, from response to planning. The Duke of York continued to oversee patrols and safety efforts, ensuring that flare-ups were addressed quickly. His role, once urgent and improvisational, became more administrative. Discipline remained necessary, but the sense of imminent catastrophe had passed. As smoke thinned, the scale of destruction became more apparent. From elevated points, observers could see vast swathes of the city reduced to ash and rubble. The burned area formed a broad scar running from the eastern riverfront through the heart of London. Estimates of damage began to circulate, growing more precise as surveying continued. Despite the devastation, life began to reassert itself almost immediately. Vendors appeared near the edges of the ruins, selling food and drink to labourers and returning residents. Temporary shelters were reinforced. Paths were cleared through debris. These small signs of activity marked the city's refusal to remain inert. The fire's fading also revealed the resilience of infrastructure that had survived. Wells still provided water. Some bridges remained intact. Portions of the street network could be restored. These survivals, modest as they were, mattered deeply. They formed the skeleton around which recovery could begin. Yet even as activity resumed, the fire's presence lingered in sensory ways. The smell of smoke clung stubbornly to the air, ash-coated surfaces. Clothing carried the scent of burning no matter how often it was washed. London would smell of fire for months. Night returned to something like darkness. Without the citywide glow of flames, the sky felt unfamiliar. Stars were visible again in clearer patches. This return of ordinary night marked a profound emotional milestone. It suggested that the city might, one day, return to ordinary days as well. The end of the fire did not bring immediate comfort. It brought exposure. With destruction no longer hidden by flame and smoke, loss stood fully revealed. The city had survived, but in altered form. People now had to confront the long work ahead. The Great Fire did not end with a dramatic final blaze. It ended quietly, unevenly, and without ceremony. The last embers faded while people were already thinking about shelter, food, and rebuilding. The fire's conclusion blended into the beginning of aftermath. London stood at a threshold. Behind it lay days of chaos and terror. Ahead lay uncertainty, effort, and change. The fire had reshaped the city, but it had not erased its inhabitants. As the last smoke drifted away, Londoners remained, ready or not, to face what came next. Taking stock of ruin, when the fire finally loosened its hold on London, the city entered a phase that felt, to many, more overwhelming than the fire itself. During the blaze, attention had been fixed on movement, survival, and immediate danger. Now, with the flames largely extinguished, Londoners were left with stillness, and in that stillness, the full scale of what had happened began to emerge. Taking stock of the ruin was not a single act, but a slow, uneven process that unfolded over days and weeks, shaped by shock, necessity, and the sheer difficulty of understanding loss on such a scale. The first attempts to assess damage were tentative. Officials, surveyors, and messengers moved cautiously through the burned districts, navigating unstable ground and smouldering debris. Many areas remained too hot or structurally unsound to enter safely. Walls leaned at dangerous angles, cellars had collapsed, piles of rubble shifted unexpectedly underfoot. The work of measurement and record-keeping advanced slowly, constrained by physical danger and exhaustion. What became immediately clear, even without precise numbers, was that the heart of the city had been gutted. Entire parishes no longer existed as coherent places. Streets ended abruptly or vanished altogether. Familiar routes were replaced by open expanses of ash and broken stone. Londoners returning to search for their homes often struggled to locate where they had once lived. Without landmarks, memory itself became unreliable. The destruction followed a broad, uneven band stretching from the eastern riverfront through the commercial core and into the western reaches of the city. The fire had not burned uniformly. Some pockets within this zone remained standing, often by chance rather than design. These surviving structures appeared almost surreal amid the devastation, isolated islands of familiarity surrounded by emptiness. Their survival prompted questions and comparisons that few could answer. Counting losses proved difficult. Early estimates varied widely. Some reports spoke of tens of thousands of houses destroyed. Others attempted to calculate losses by parish or ward. Over time, figures became clearer. Thousands of homes gone, scores of churches reduced to ruins, civic buildings destroyed, warehouses emptied not by removal but by fire. Yet even these numbers failed to capture the human dimension. Homelessness became the most immediate and pressing concern. Tens of thousands of Londoners had no roof to return to. Many were already camped outside the city in makeshift shelters. Others crowded into surviving districts, staying with relatives, friends, or strangers. Overcrowding intensified. Sanitation deteriorated. Disease became a concern once again, though mercifully, no major outbreak followed immediately. The city authorities faced logistical challenges unlike any they had known. Providing shelter, food, and order for such a displaced population strained resources to the limit. Temporary housing was improvised where possible. Tents, sheds, and rough wooden structures appeared on the edges of the city and in open spaces within it. These were intended as short-term solutions, but many would remain for months. Food supply was another urgent issue. Markets within the burned area were gone. Warehouses storing grain and other staples had been destroyed. Transport routes were disrupted. Prices rose quickly. The poor were hit hardest, lacking reserves or credit. Authorities intervened where they could, regulating prices and encouraging supplies to be brought in from surrounding areas. These measures mitigated the worst effects, but could not fully erase hardship. Economic loss extended beyond immediate survival. Merchants had lost stock, craftsmen had lost tools and workshops. Records of debts, contracts, and ownership had burned. Legal disputes loomed as people attempted to reconstruct claims from memory or partial documentation. The fire had not merely destroyed property, it had disrupted the systems that defined economic relationships. Insurance, still a developing concept, proved inadequate to the scale of the disaster. Many losses were uninsured or underinsured. This reality forced individuals and institutions to rely on personal resources, charity, or royal assistance. It also spurred new thinking about risk and protection that would shape future financial practices. The Crown moved to assert stability and reassurance. King Charles II issued proclamations addressing relief, order, and rebuilding. He emphasized that the city would be restored and that assistance would be provided. These statements were important psychologically, signalling continuity of governance even as the physical city lay in ruins. At the same time, the king established commissions to investigate the causes of the fire and to oversee reconstruction. These bodies were tasked with gathering evidence, hearing testimony, and making recommendations. Their work began amid uncertainty and emotion, complicating the search for clear conclusions. Blame became an undercurrent in the process of taking stock. People sought reasons for their loss, and in doing so sought responsibility. Rumours of arson resurfaced, often directed at foreigners or marginalised groups. Despite official efforts to counter these narratives, suspicion lingered. A French watchmaker, Robert Hubert, would later be accused and executed, despite evidence of his innocence. His case reflected the need many felt to attach blame, even when facts did not support it. The physical act of clearing debris became a massive undertaking. Before rebuilding could begin, ruins had to be stabilised or removed. This required labour, tools, and organisation. Rubble was sorted. Salvageable materials were recovered where possible. Stone blocks were reused. Bricks were cleaned. Metal was melted down. Even in devastation, nothing was wasted if it could be repurposed. Clearing the city also meant addressing hazards. Smouldering remains posed fire risks. Unstable walls threatened collapse. Wells and drains had been damaged or contaminated. Each hazard required attention. This work was slow and often dangerous, carried out by labourers who themselves had lost homes and livelihoods. As the ruins were surveyed, patterns emerged. Officials could see which areas had been most vulnerable, which building practices had failed fastest, and which had offered some resistance. These observations informed early discussions about rebuilding. The fire had created, inadvertently, a vast urban laboratory. Londoners themselves participated in this assessment informally. Conversations turned to comparisons. Whose house had burned first? Whose street had survived longest? Where the fire had jumped unexpectedly? These stories circulated widely, shaping collective understanding. Memory and myth began to intertwine, even as facts were still being gathered. The loss of churches weighed heavily on communities. Parishes that had defined social life for generations were suddenly without physical centres. Clergy held services outdoors or in surviving buildings, often combining congregations. These gatherings served not only religious functions but also social ones, allowing people to share news and support. Education was disrupted as schools burned or were repurposed as shelters. Children's routines vanished. Apprenticeships were interrupted. The long-term effects of this disruption were difficult to measure, but they added to the sense that normal life had been suspended indefinitely. For the elite and wealthy, the fire brought different challenges. While many had resources to relocate temporarily or rebuild quickly, they also faced significant losses. Grand houses within the city were destroyed. Collections of art, books, and furnishings burned. Social life shifted westward toward less affected areas, subtly altering the city's cultural geography. The process of taking stock also involved emotional reckoning. Grief was widespread but often private. Public mourning was limited, in part because the scale of loss made individual expression difficult. There were relatively few recorded deaths compared to the destruction, but this fact did little to lessen sorrow. Loss of home and livelihood carried its own trauma. Some Londoners experienced a sense of unreality. Walking through the ruins felt like moving through a dream or nightmare. Familiar sounds were absent. The city seemed hollowed out. This disorientation lingered long after physical danger had passed. Yet alongside grief was a pragmatic determination. People began to plan, to make lists, to imagine next steps. Temporary solutions were accepted with the understanding that they were temporary. The language of rebuilding entered everyday conversation. Hope, cautious and conditional, began to take shape. The taking of stock extended beyond the city itself. News of the fire spread across England and beyond. Letters described the devastation. Donations arrived from other towns and from abroad. London's importance as a national and international centre ensured that its loss was felt widely. This external attention brought aid, but also scrutiny. As weeks passed, assessments became more systematic. Maps were drawn showing burned areas. Surveys measured plots. Records were reconstructed. This administrative work laid the foundation for rebuilding. But it also imposed order on chaos, transforming lived experience into data. The act of taking stock was, in effect, the first step toward recovery. It required facing loss directly, without the distraction of immediate danger. It demanded patience, cooperation, and resilience. For Londoners, it was an exhausting but necessary transition. The city that emerged from this process was not yet rebuilt, but it was redefined. The ruins were not merely evidence of destruction. They were the raw material of a new London. Every measurement, every cleared path, every provisional shelter contributed to the shape of what would follow. In the quiet after the fire, London confronted itself. It counted what was gone, acknowledged what remained, and began, slowly, to imagine what could be rebuilt. The work of taking stock did not heal wounds, but it made healing possible. Out of ash and rubble, a reckoning took place, practical, emotional, and deeply human. London had survived the fire. Now it had to understand what survival meant: blame, fear, and rumours. As the smoke thinned and the ruins cooled, a different kind of fire began to spread through London, one that fed not on timber or wind, but on fear, anger, and uncertainty. In the absence of clear answers, people searched for causes that went beyond accident and circumstance. The Great Fire had destroyed too much, too completely, to be accepted easily as the result of chance. For many Londoners, understanding the disaster meant finding someone to blame. This impulse emerged almost immediately. Even while the fire still burned, whispers circulated through camps and crowded streets. Some said the fire had started in more than one place. Others claimed they had seen suspicious figures throwing fireballs or spreading pitch. Each retelling added detail, urgency, and certainty. In a city already shaped by recent war and lingering political tension, such stories found fertile ground. England was at war with the Dutch Republic in 1666, and hostility toward foreigners was already present before the fire began. Dutch and French merchants lived and worked in London, particularly near the riverfront. Their presence, once tolerated or even welcomed for economic reasons, now became suspect. Accents, unfamiliar customs, and foreign dress drew attention in ways they had not before. Crowds gathered around anyone rumoured to be a foreigner. In some cases, violence followed. People were detained, questioned, and beaten, based on little more than hearsay. The breakdown of normal order during the fire had created opportunities for both fear and aggression to flourish. Once the immediate danger passed, these emotions did not simply disappear. They turned inward, seeking explanation. Religious interpretation also played a role in shaping blame. Some preachers framed the fire as divine punishment for moral failings, sin, pride, or religious division. These sermons did not always name specific individuals, but they reinforced the idea that the disaster had purpose. If the fire was judgment, then someone or something must have deserved it. This moral framing made accidental explanations feel insufficient. Political suspicion added another layer. England's recent history of civil war and regicide had left deep scars. Trust in authority was fragile. Some Londoners believed the fire had been allowed to spread deliberately, either through incompetence or conspiracy. The hesitation of city officials in the early hours became a focal point for criticism. Decisions that had seemed cautious at the time now appeared negligent in hindsight. Rumours also targeted marginalised groups within the city. Catholics, already viewed with suspicion in Protestant England, became subjects of accusation. The Great Fire occurred only months after the execution of several men accused of involvement in Catholic plots. In this climate, it was easy for some to believe that the fire was part of a broader conspiracy. Authorities attempted to counter these narratives. Proclamations were issued, urging calm and warning against vigilante violence. King Charles II himself spoke against attacks on foreigners, emphasising that the fire was not the result of enemy action. These efforts had mixed success. While official voices carried weight, they competed with personal testimony and emotional conviction. The search for blame eventually focused on individuals. The most infamous case was that of Robert Hubert, a French watchmaker. Hubert confessed to starting the fire, claiming he had thrown a fireball into the bakery on Pudding Lane. His confession was inconsistent and contradicted by evidence, including the fact that he had arrived in London after the fire had already begun. Nonetheless, he was convicted and executed. Hubert's case revealed the depth of the need for explanation. His confession, however flawed, offered closure of a kind. It allowed the fire to be framed as an act with an author, rather than a convergence of conditions and failures. For authorities, the execution signalled that justice had been done. For the public, it provided a focal point for grief and anger. Yet doubts persisted. Many recognised the implausibility of Hubert's story. Some accounts questioned the fairness of his trial even at the time. These doubts did not prevent the narrative from taking hold, but they lingered, adding complexity to the fire's legacy. Beyond individual blame, fear shaped behaviour in subtle ways. People remained wary of one another. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Even familiar neighbours were sometimes scrutinised, especially if they had behaved unexpectedly during the fire. Trust, once eroded, was slow to rebuild. The camps of displaced Londoners became spaces where rumours circulated freely. Information travelled by word of mouth, shaped by emotion and repetition. Without reliable news sources, stories evolved rapidly. Each retelling emphasised danger and intention. Fires in other cities, past or present, were invoked as comparisons, often inaccurately. Economic fear also fed suspicion. Competition for scarce resources intensified. Rising prices for food and materials bred resentment. Accusations of profiteering circulated, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Merchants who survived the fire intact were sometimes viewed with envy or mistrust. The process of rebuilding further inflamed tensions. Decisions about where and how to rebuild affected livelihoods and property values. Disputes arose over land boundaries, now erased by fire. In these disputes, the fire itself became a weapon in argument, cited as evidence of divine favour, misfortune, or wrongdoing. Despite these pressures, London did not descend into sustained chaos. The presence of royal authority and the gradual return of order helped contain violence. Courts resumed operation. Legal processes addressed disputes, however imperfectly. Over time, the most extreme rumours lost force. Still, the period of blame and fear left marks. It influenced how the fire was remembered and narrated. Early accounts emphasised conspiracy and malice more than later ones. Over time, as rebuilding progressed and the city regained stability, explanations shifted toward accident and systemic vulnerability. This evolution reflected not just new information but emotional distance. For historians, this phase of the fire's aftermath offers insight into how societies process disaster. Blame serves psychological functions. It imposes order on chaos. It offers moral clarity where physical explanations feel unsatisfying. In London's case, it also exposed existing fault lines, national, religious, economic, that the fire did not create but did intensify. The fear that followed the fire was not entirely irrational. Londoners had witnessed their city destroyed in days. They had seen systems fail and authority hesitate. Distrust was a natural response. What mattered was how that fear was eventually managed. Over time, practical needs overshadowed suspicion. Shelter, work, and rebuilding demanded cooperation. As people laboured side by side, clearing rubble and raising new structures, shared purpose gradually replaced accusation. Memory of the fire shifted from immediate trauma to collective experience. Yet the stories told during this period did not vanish. They entered pamphlets, sermons, and later histories. Some were repeated uncritically, others were challenged. Together, they formed a layered narrative in which fact, fear, and interpretation coexisted. The Great Fire of London was not only a physical catastrophe, it was a social and psychological one. The flames exposed not just wooden beams and dry roofs, but anxieties rooted in war, religion, and identity. Blame and rumour were part of the fire's afterburn, extending its impact beyond the days it burned. In time, London would learn to explain the fire differently, focusing on structure, planning, and prevention. But in the immediate aftermath, understanding came through emotion more than analysis. Fear sought a face, blame sought a name. This phase, uncomfortable and often unjust, was nonetheless part of the city's path forward. It revealed vulnerabilities not just in buildings but in trust. Confronting these vulnerabilities became as important as rebuilding streets and houses. As London moved slowly from suspicion toward reconstruction, the echoes of fear faded, but they did not disappear entirely. They remained embedded in memory, a reminder that disasters burn not only cities but also the fragile bonds that hold them together. Rebuilding a capital. When the urgency of blame and rumour began to recede, it was replaced by a challenge no less daunting: how to rebuild a capital that had, in many places, ceased to exist. Rebuilding London was not a single project, nor a unified vision carried out smoothly from plan to completion. It was a long negotiation between ambition and reality, shaped by competing interests, limited resources, and the sheer scale of what had been lost. The fire had cleared space, but it had not cleared disagreement. Almost immediately, proposals for a new London began to circulate. Architects, surveyors, and thinkers saw in the ruins an opportunity to correct centuries of unplanned growth. The fire had erased medieval street patterns in vast areas. Where once there had been tangled lanes and overhanging houses, there was now open ground. Some imagined a city of wide boulevards, orderly grids, and grand public spaces. Others envisioned improved sanitation, fire-resistant construction, and clearer separation between residential and commercial areas. Among the most notable figures to put forward ideas was Christopher Wren, already known for his work as a scientist and architect. His plans, like those of several contemporaries, proposed a rational layout inspired by classical ideals. Streets would be widened, traffic would flow more easily, churches and public buildings would anchor neighbourhoods with deliberate symmetry. Fire, if it ever returned, would be easier to contain. These visions were ambitious and, in many ways, forward-looking. Yet they faced immediate obstacles. London was not an empty site owned by a single authority. Property rights were deeply entrenched. Even where buildings had burned completely, land ownership remained. Thousands of individuals held claims to plots now reduced to ash. Rebuilding had to respect these claims or risk endless legal conflict. The urgency of shelter further constrained planning. Tens of thousands were still displaced. Temporary housing could not remain temporary indefinitely. People needed roofs, workshops, and shops to resume life and work. Grand plans that required years of surveying and negotiation were difficult to justify when immediate needs pressed. The Crown and city authorities sought compromise. Rather than redesigning the entire city, they focused on establishing new building regulations that would shape reconstruction within existing property lines. This approach preserved ownership while addressing some of the vulnerabilities revealed by the fire. One of the most significant changes concerned materials. New laws required that houses be built of brick or stone rather than timber, at least in central areas. Roofs were to be tiled rather than thatched. Party walls between buildings were thickened to reduce fire spread. These measures did not eliminate risk, but they significantly reduced it. Street widths were also addressed, though less radically than some planners had hoped. In certain areas, streets were widened where possible, especially where demolition during the fire had already created space. Elsewhere, widening was limited by existing boundaries. The result was a city improved in places, but still shaped by its past. The rebuilding process required extensive coordination. Surveyors mapped plots anew, establishing boundaries where markers had been destroyed. Courts were set up to resolve disputes quickly, preventing legal paralysis. These courts aimed for pragmatism over perfection, prioritizing progress. Financing reconstruction posed another challenge. Many property owners lacked the resources to rebuild immediately. Loans were arranged, partnerships formed. In some cases, plots changed hands as owners sold to those with greater means. This process altered the social composition of some neighbourhoods, introducing new patterns of ownership and investment. Trades gradually returned. Brickmakers, masons, carpenters and labourers found abundant work. The demand for materials reshaped surrounding regions as clay pits were worked and stone quarried. The rebuilding of London became an economic engine in its own right, drawing labour from across England. Church reconstruction was a central concern. With dozens of parish churches destroyed, religious life required new spaces. Wren and others were commissioned to design replacements. These new churches, built over decades, would become defining features of London's skyline. They reflected both continuity of worship and transformation of architectural style. St. Paul's Cathedral in particular became a symbol of renewal. The decision to rebuild it on a grand scale was deliberate. The new cathedral would not merely replace what had been lost, it would assert London's resilience and ambition. Construction would take decades, but the commitment was made early, anchoring the rebuilding effort in a shared goal. Public infrastructure also demanded attention. Water supply systems damaged by the fire had to be repaired or replaced. Drainage was reconsidered. Markets were relocated or redesigned. Each improvement required negotiation between cost, benefit, and tradition. Rebuilding was uneven in pace. Wealthier districts rose more quickly, poorer areas lagged. Temporary structures remained longer than intended. The contrast between newly built brick houses and makeshift shelters highlighted ongoing inequality. Authorities attempted to address these disparities, but resources were finite. Despite challenges, momentum built steadily. The sight of new walls rising where ruins had stood offered tangible reassurance. Each completed house or shop represented not just recovery, but confidence. The city was not merely surviving, it was asserting continuity. Cultural life adapted as well. Theatres reopened, coffee houses, many rebuilt from scratch, became centres of discussion and exchange. These spaces played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and fostering a sense of shared experience. The fire became a common reference point, discussed and interpreted in countless conversations. Memory of the fire influenced design choices beyond formal regulations. Builders and residents alike were more cautious. Chimneys were better constructed. Storage of flammable goods was reconsidered. These changes were not always codified, but they reflected lessons learned through loss. The rebuilding of London did not erase grief. For many, returning to rebuilt streets meant confronting absence. Neighbours gone, familiar rhythms altered. Yet these emotional undercurrents did not prevent progress. They coexisted with determination. Over time, the city that emerged was recognisably London, but different in character. Brick replaced timber. Streets felt more open. The skyline changed. The fire had not erased history, but it had redirected it. Rebuilding a capital is never merely a technical task. It involves choices about identity, memory, and future risk. In London's case, these choices were made incrementally, shaped by compromise rather than vision alone. The result was not the ideal city imagined by planners, but a more resilient one. The Great Fire thus became both an end and a beginning. It closed the chapter on medieval London and opened another defined by regulation, planning, and adaptation. The rebuilt city carried scars, but also strengths born of experience. As walls rose and streets filled again with life, Londoners learned to inhabit a city shaped by fire without being defined by it. The work of rebuilding continued for decades, but its foundations were laid in these early years, when necessity guided innovation and loss demanded change. A changed city. As rebuilding advanced and the raw urgency of survival faded, London entered a quieter but no less significant phase of transformation. The fire had ended, the rubble had been cleared in many places, and new walls were rising, but beneath this visible recovery lay deeper changes that reshaped how the city functioned, governed itself, and understood its own past. London was no longer merely repaired, it was altered in ways that would persist long after memories of smoke and flame had softened. One of the most immediate changes was visual. The rebuilt city looked different. Brick facades replaced timber frames. Rooflines became more uniform. Party walls stood thicker and higher, breaking the continuous surfaces that had once allowed fire to race unchecked from house to house. Even where medieval street patterns survived, the character of those streets had shifted. London felt heavier, more solid. less improvised. These changes affected how people moved through the city. Streets widened where possible, allowed carts to pass more easily. Traffic flowed with slightly less friction. Congestion did not disappear. London remained crowded, but movement felt more deliberate. The city no longer leaned inward quite so aggressively. Space, once a luxury, had been reclaimed in small but meaningful ways. Fire consciousness became embedded in everyday thinking. Londoners did not need reminders of what unchecked flame could do. Chimneys were inspected more carefully. Hearths were treated with greater caution. Storage of flammable goods, especially within residential areas, drew more scrutiny. While no city could eliminate fire risk entirely, London had learned to live with it differently. Governance also changed. The fire had exposed weaknesses in authority, coordination, and emergency response. In its aftermath, the city placed greater emphasis on regulation and oversight. Building codes were enforced more consistently. Surveyors and inspectors gained prominence. The relationship between civic authority and private property shifted subtly toward collective safety. Insurance practices expanded as well. The fire had demonstrated how devastating loss could be when risk was borne individually. New fire insurance companies emerged, offering policies that covered rebuilding costs. These companies employed their own private fire brigades, marking an early step toward professionalized firefighting. While these brigades served policyholders first, their presence contributed to broader urban safety. Economic life adapted to new realities. Some trades relocated permanently to less crowded districts. Others consolidated, operating from fewer but larger premises. The fire accelerated trends already underway, nudging London toward a more centralised and capital-intensive economy. This shift favoured those with resources and connections, subtly altering class dynamics. The geography of prestige shifted as well. Wealthy residents increasingly favoured areas west of the old city core, where rebuilding had been less chaotic and space more available. This westward drift reinforced patterns that would continue into the 18th century, shaping London's social map. The city remained a commercial heart, but residential life diversified. Culturally, the fire became a reference point for identity. Londoners spoke of life before and after the fire as distinct eras. Stories of escape, loss, and survival circulated within families and communities. These narratives were retold not to dwell on trauma, but to anchor memory. The fire became part of how London explained itself. Art and literature reflected this shift. Writers described the ruins and rebuilding with a mix of sobriety and resolve. The fire was no longer framed purely as divine punishment or random disaster, but as a turning point that demanded learning. This pragmatic interpretation distinguished later accounts from the emotionally charged pamphlets of the immediate aftermath. Religious life adapted to the new urban landscape. Rebuilt churches, many designed by Christopher Wren, offered spaces that felt lighter and more ordered than their medieval predecessors. These buildings embodied a balance between continuity and change. Worship continued, but in settings shaped by fire-aware design. St. Paul's Cathedral, though still under construction for many years, became a focal symbol of the changed city. Its rising dome signalled not a return to the past, but a confident step into a different future. Londoners watched its progress as a sign that the city's identity could be renewed without being erased. Education and learning also felt the fire's influence. The loss of libraries and records highlighted the fragility of knowledge stored in physical form. Efforts to preserve documents and books gained urgency. Institutions became more conscious of archiving and redundancy, understanding that memory itself required protection. Public attitudes toward disaster evolved. The fire did not eliminate superstition or fear, but it tempered them with experience. Londoners had seen that catastrophe could arise from ordinary conditions, not just extraordinary causes. This awareness encouraged planning, preparation, and a cautious respect for complexity. The legal system reflected these lessons. New courts and procedures developed to handle disputes efficiently. Property law adapted to address rebuilding and compensation. These changes did not solve every conflict, but they reduced paralysis. The city had learned that delay carried its own risks. Social bonds, strained during the fire and its aftermath, gradually reformed. Shared experience fostered a sense of collective identity that crossed some traditional boundaries. While inequalities persisted, there was a broader recognition that disaster did not discriminate. This understanding influenced charitable efforts and civic engagement. London's changed character extended beyond its walls. The city's experience became a reference point for other towns and cities across England and Europe. Observers studied London's rebuilding to learn how urban centres might adapt to large-scale disaster. In this way, the Great Fire's impact reached far beyond the Thames. Memory of the fire was preserved deliberately. Monuments were erected. Anniversaries were marked. These acts ensured that the disaster would not fade into obscurity. Remembering the fire was not about dwelling on loss, but about reinforcing lessons learned through suffering. Yet for all these changes, continuity remained. Londoners returned to markets, taverns, workshops and churches. Life resumed its rhythms, altered but recognisable. The city's energy, its capacity for trade and exchange, remained intact. Change did not extinguish character, it reshaped it. The Great Fire had stripped London down to essentials and forced reconsideration of habits long taken for granted. In response, the city emerged more regulated, more cautious, and more resilient. These qualities did not make London immune to future disasters, but they improved its capacity to respond. A changed city is not defined solely by what has been built, but by what has been learned. London carried forward the memory of fire as a quiet companion to progress. Each brick laid, each regulation enforced, reflected an understanding earned at great cost. By the time rebuilding was well underway, London was no longer simply recovering. It was redefining itself. The city that emerged was not the London of memory, nor the London of ideal plans, but something in between practical, scarred, and enduring. The fire had taken much, but it had also forced clarity. London had confronted its vulnerability and responded with adaptation. That response, more than the flames themselves, defined the city's future. Long after the last embers cooled and the sound of rebuilding replaced the roar of flames, the Great Fire of London continued to exert influence in ways both obvious and subtle. Its legacy did not reside solely in architecture or law, nor only in memory and story, but in the quiet assumptions that shaped how Londoners thought about risk, responsibility, and the city itself. The fire became a reference point, a shared experience against which future choices were measured, often without being explicitly named. One of the most enduring legacies of the fire was the idea that cities are systems, not just collections of buildings. Before 1666, London had grown through accumulation rather than coordination. Streets followed habit, construction followed convenience. The fire revealed the consequences of that approach with brutal clarity. In response, London did not become perfectly planned, but it became consciously governed. Urban growth was no longer entirely organic. It was managed, regulated, and debated. This shift altered how authority was understood. The fire demonstrated that individual decisions, how a house was built, how goods were stored, how quickly action was taken, could have consequences far beyond the individual. Collective safety became a legitimate reason for collective rules. This principle underpinned new building codes, fire regulations, and enforcement practices. Over time, it reshaped the relationship between private property and public good. Fire insurance, still in its infancy before 1666, expanded rapidly afterward. The idea that risk could be shared, quantified, and managed financially gained credibility. Insurance companies not only offered compensation, but actively invested in prevention. Their private fire brigades, though limited and sometimes selective, represented an important step toward organised urban firefighting. These developments influenced other cities and laid groundwork for modern emergency services. The fire also left a lasting imprint on London's physical memory. The monument, erected near the site of the fire's origin, served not merely as a memorial, but as a statement of interpretation. Its inscriptions framed the fire as a lesson learned and overcome. Though its wording would be contested and revised over time, the monument symbolized the desire to control narrative as well as rebuild structure. In education and scholarship, the fire encouraged documentation and analysis. Diaries, letters, and reports written during and after the disaster became valuable records. Samuel Pepys's account, among others, offered detailed observations that future generations would study. These writings shaped historical method by emphasizing eyewitness testimony and personal perspective alongside official records. The Great Fire also influenced how disasters were explained. Immediate interpretations had leaned heavily toward moral judgment and conspiracy. Over time, these gave way to explanations rooted in material conditions, human error, and systemic vulnerability. This evolution reflected broader shifts in scientific and philosophical thought. The fire became an example of how complex events arise from ordinary factors interacting unexpectedly. Culturally, the fire entered London's identity as both wound and proof of resilience. It was invoked during later crises, plagues, wars, and other fires as a reminder that the city had endured worse. This memory fostered confidence but also caution. Londoners learned not to assume permanence. Buildings could fall, systems could fail. Preparedness mattered. The rebuilt city, with its brick houses and wider streets, stood as a visible testament to learning through loss. Each structure embodied choices informed by memory. Even residents who had not lived through the fire inhabited spaces shaped by its lessons. The legacy thus passed silently from generation to generation. Beyond London, the fire's influence spread through Europe and beyond. Urban planners, architects, and officials studied London's response and rebuilding. While each city faced its own conditions, the principles of fire-resistant construction and regulated growth gained wider acceptance. The Great Fire became part of a broader conversation about urban modernity. The fire also reshaped London's sense of time. The phrase, "since the fire," became a common marker, dividing personal and civic histories. This temporal division simplified memory, but it also clarified narrative. The fire provided a clear turning point, allowing Londoners to frame change as progress rather than decline. Yet the legacy was not uniformly positive. Inequalities persisted and, in some cases, deepened. Rebuilding favoured those with resources. Poorer residents were pushed to margins or crowded into less desirable areas. The fire did not create these disparities, but it exposed and sometimes amplified them. Understanding the legacy requires acknowledging these uneven outcomes. In legal and administrative practice, the fire reinforced the importance of record keeping and redundancy. Lost documents had caused confusion and conflict. In response, institutions became more careful about preserving copies and safeguarding archives. This attention to documentation supported more stable governance. Emotionally, the fire left traces that are harder to measure. Survivors carried memories of heat, noise, and loss throughout their lives. These memories influenced attitudes towards safety and change. Even those born later absorbed stories that shaped perception. The fire became part of London's emotional landscape. The Great Fire's legacy also lay in restraint. It taught that disaster need not be framed as spectacle or moral drama alone. Over time, the fire was remembered with sobriety rather than sensationalism. This tone influenced how London approached later challenges, favouring pragmatic response over panic. Perhaps most importantly, the fire demonstrated the capacity of a city to adapt. London did not simply rebuild what had been lost. It re-examined itself. It asked, implicitly and explicitly, how it might function better. The answers were partial and imperfect, but they were real. The city that emerged from the fire was not immune to future disasters. Fires continued to occur. Wars would come, plagues would return. But London faced these challenges with a deeper understanding of its own complexity. The fire had revealed weakness, but it had also revealed strength. In this way, the Great Fire became less a story of destruction than of transformation. Its legacy was not confined to the days it burned, or the years it took to rebuild. It lived on in decisions, designs, and attitudes that shaped London's evolution. When Londoners walked, rebuilt streets, worked in new shops, and gathered in new churches, they participated in a city informed by memory. The fire was no longer visible, but it was present in brick and law, in habit and caution. The legacy of the Great Fire of London is therefore not a single lesson, but a collection of insights earned at great cost. It reminds us that cities are fragile, that systems matter, and that recovery is as much about learning as it is about rebuilding. London endured, changed, and continued. That endurance, tempered by experience, stands as the fire's most enduring legacy. And in time, children are born who did not see the fire at all. They grow up hearing fragments how the sky once burned, how people fled with what they could carry, how the city stood again. To them, the fire is history, not memory. Yet they walk streets shaped by it, live in houses designed because of it, benefit from order created in response to it. This is how cities survive, not by erasing disaster, but by carrying it gently forward, letting it inform rather than define. The Great Fire of London becomes part of the city's long story, not the end of a chapter, but the moment the page turned. So now, as the city settles into night once more, there is no urgency, no warning bells, just the ordinary sounds of life continuing, steady and unremarkable in the best way. If your breathing has slowed, let it. If your thoughts are drifting, allow them to drift. The story has been told. The fire is out.